Hi guys, tonight we drift together into a winter so sharp it feels as if it has teeth of winter that presses close around you the moment you step into Christmas of the year 1403. You find yourself standing inside a continent held still under a cold that refuses to loosen its grip. Snow settles around you like a slow falling curtain, the kind that mutes the world until every sound feels distant and softened. Your breath rises in thin clouds that break apart and vanish before you even have time to notice. It is the sort of cold that asks questions about how long you can last here and whether you really should have stepped outside without 2 more layers. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights and allow this frozen world to ease into your mind as you take a slow breath and feel the story begin to unfold around you. You start walking into the heart of this continent, and the first thing you notice is the sky. It feels unusually heavy tonight, the kind of heavy that sits on your shoulders as if the entire atmosphere has thickened. Colours fade into a deep slate. Clouds hang low enough to feel reachable. The air crackles with a kind of dry silence that makes your ears ring. You look around and sense that this is not a winter you drop into for holiday joy or cosy gatherings. This is winter as a force that decides things, a presence that shifts history in ways people would remember, in quiet stories for generations. A mainstream historical fact often mentioned by scholars is that early 15th century Europe faced repeated climatic strain caused by the tail end of what scientists later named the Little Ice Age. You feel that pressure tonight as your boots crunch against a surface that should be soft earth but has turned into something closer to glass. Each step sends a small vibration up through your legs. You do not so much walk across a landscape as glide over a polished sheet that used to be alive with crops and dust and the smell of animals. But winter has pressed its signature onto everything, flattening the familiar into something harsher. You move through a field where rows of stubble protrude from snow like broken ribs. The silence that covers the land has a strange beauty, the sort that pulls you inward and makes you breathe slower. At the same time, it carries a hint of unease. This is the kind of cold that can quiet an entire village. No carts, no voices, no movement beyond the drifting white. Historians still argue whether the winter of 1403 was the single harshest freeze of that decade, or whether several years blurred together in a collective memory of cold. You do not need the specifics tonight. You can feel enough simply by standing here and watching frost form around your eyelashes. A quirky tidbit preserved in a few scattered monastic notes suggests that some villagers believed the cold sharpened sound differently. They claimed that a whispered prayer could travel farther across frozen fields than spoken words could in summer. You test that idea in your mind as you keep walking. Maybe it is true. Maybe it is just the way imagination fills the edges of a long and difficult season. Either way, the thought settles around you like an extra layer. Something small and comforting inside this landscape that feels so large and indifferent. You move along a road that used to carry merchants and pilgrims. Now it is an empty ribbon of white, stretching between villages like a long pause. The snow does not fall in thick sheets tonight. Instead, it drifts quietly, almost politely, as if saving its weight for later storms. You pull your cloak a little tighter and listen to how your footsteps echo. The sound bounces strangely, as if the ground is hollow. It creates a rhythm that almost feels musical. You let it guide your pace, slow, even, gentle. You are not in a hurry. Winter does not reward haste here. It rewards patience and careful movement. You pass a line of skeletal trees that stand like watchful guardians. Their branches are weighed down by frost that sparkles in the faint light. When the wind stirs even slightly, a fine powder drops from their limbs and drifts across your path like ghostly breath. The moment feels suspended, as if time has slowed for your arrival. You stand between these trees and sense how deeply the cold has seeped into their bark. You wonder if they remember softer winters. You wonder if anyone does. Off in the distance, a single cottage window glows, a small amber square against the white. You feel drawn toward it the way a traveller on a long journey seeks any sign of life. The glow reminds you that although this winter grips the continent firmly, people still persist inside it. They endure. They adapt. They complain, of course, because complaining about cold is universal, across all centuries. But they continue living, and their small pockets of warmth ripple outward into the night. As you approach the cottage, you imagine the family inside, wrapped in wool, huddled by a fire that must be tended every few minutes just to stay alive. You picture hands hovering above fading embers. You picture the soft cracking of logs that took all summer to gather. You picture children half asleep waiting for morning, hoping that tomorrow the frost might ease. Their hopes are modest, the sort of hopes winter allows. You stop a few steps from the door. You do not knock. You simply stand there, letting the warmth leaking through the wood reach you in a faint whisper. It reminds you that even in a winter, this brutal comfort still exists, small, fragile, but real. And then you step back into the night, ready to follow the road deeper into this continent, locked in ice. You leave the village's edge behind you and step onto a frozen road that no longer feels like a path meant for travel, but more like a long sheet of dulled metal stretching across the landscape. Each footfall sends a tiny shiver through the hardened surface, a reminder that the world under you has become something tighter, sharper, and far less forgiving than dirt or cobblestone. The cold sinks deeper into your legs as you move, curling up through the soles of your boots, like a slow, determined creature trying to claim your warmth. Wind sweeps across the open fields beside you, carrying the faint chime of something loose on a distant cart, maybe a lantern hook, maybe a forgotten hinge. Sound travels strangely here. The cold doesn't swallow it, but rather sharpens it, slicing it into the night so cleanly that you can't tell how far away it is. You keep your head tucked low as you trudge forward, watching your breath twist in two small clouds that vanish almost before you can even notice them. A mainstream historical fact that drifts through your mind is that trade roads in medieval Europe were often nothing more than well-worn dirt tracks, their shapes shifting year after year, depending on weather and foot traffic. In winters like this, those paths could freeze solid enough to halt entire caravans, leaving markets and towns cut off from their usual winter lifelines. And right now, you feel the truth of that. Even a single step requires negotiation with the ice. You test the ground every few paces, sliding the edge of your boot forward, gently, before trusting your weight. You imagine merchants just like you doing the same thing. 6 centuries ago, one careful step, then another, hoping their cart wheels would not seize or splinter in the bitter cold. A quirky little tidbit fits into your thoughts. Some travellers scattered ashes from burnt herbs onto the ice, believing the dark powder not only helped with traction, but also frightened away winter spirits lurking along the road. You picture a man shaking a soot-filled pouch, muttering something hopeful to the darkness before tugging his horse forward again. Your fingers curl inside your gloves, warming and freezing in cycles depending on how tightly you clench them. You lift one hand to your cheek and feel the sting of wind where the road opens wide, the fields stretching out like a flat, pale desert. Historians still argue whether the winter of 1403 created a brief collapse in regional trade, or whether communities had already adapted to the worsening climate long before this freezing season arrived. But as you move forward on this silent road, you do not feel like you're crossing something people were prepared for. You feel like you're stepping into a crisis that crept in quietly, then refused to leave. The moon hides behind thick banks of cloud, and you rely on the faint, uneven glow of distant villages to guide your path. Every so often you see the pale silhouette of a leafless tree leaning toward the road, like a watchman, its branches brittle and skeletal. The wind makes those branches hiss as if they are whispering warnings, though you cannot quite make out the words. You hear something behind you, a sudden sharp crack. You whirl around, heart lifting for a moment, before you realise It is just the sound of ice shifting beneath the temperature's constant pressure. Even still, it sets your nerves on edge. You walk a little faster now, your boots tapping in a careful rhythm that carries your weight across the irregular surface. Some patches shine like polished glass. Others hold the rough grain of old earth frozen mid-texture. You feel each transition beneath your feet. Your cloak snaps against your legs when the wind rises again, carrying grains of snow that sting your skin like tiny thrown stones. You tug the fabric closer to your chest, burying your face in its folds for a bit of borrowed warmth. The road curves slightly, and a cluster of bare shrubs appears, like dark smudges on the pale landscape. In daylight, they might be unremarkable, but in the night, they resemble small silhouettes, waiting for you to pass. You lean forward as you continue stepping into deeper drifts that swallow your ankles. The snow here has been tossed aside by earlier travellers, someone dragging a cart maybe, or perhaps a rider dismounting to check his horse's hooves. You see faint impressions where animals struggled, their prints uneven and chaotic. It feels like the road is telling you a story, who passed how desperate they were, how heavy their burdens became. The sky opens for a moment, revealing a thin scatter of stars shimmering with the cold brightness of salt crystals tossed across black velvet. The sight gives you a small lift, though not much warmth. You let the stars guide you for a handful of breaths before clouds swallow them again. The night feels heavier afterward, as though losing those stars drops a curtain of deeper silence around you. You keep moving, because there is nothing else to do, and because the cold punishes stillness even more than motion. Your boots slide once, then twice before your instincts catch you. You steady yourself by reaching toward a wooden milestone, half buried in snow, its carved markings softened by frost. You run your glove across its surface and feel the ridges of a symbol marking distance. Not that it is much comfort to know how far you are from anywhere warm. Your path continues over a slight rise, and as you crest it, you glimpse the faint yellow glow of another village far ahead. The sight settles something inside you, the way a candle flame settles the darkness around it. You know it will take time to reach that light, but at least the road continues, and your steps still belong somewhere. A horse whinnies faintly from beyond a cluster of trees, a lonely and tired sound. Perhaps a traveller has stopped to rest, waiting for dawn. Perhaps it is just a stray animal, searching for hay. The noise echoes and vanishes, swallowed by the cold. You keep walking, wrapped in the quiet rhythm of your breath, and the road beneath you, feeling the slow shift of the world as you push deeper into a winter night that tests every step you take. You reach the village proper just as the cold finishes settling into your bones, the kind of deep chill that makes your joints feel stiff and oddly distant, as though your body is slowly turning into another piece of this frozen landscape. The first houses rise ahead of you with their thatched roofs buried under heavy snow, each one shaped more by necessity than beauty, each one leaning slightly, as if trying to hide from the wind. You step between them and immediately feel the air shift, not warmer, just less wild, less knife-edged than on the open road. Your boots crunch through a layer of packed snow where dozens of footsteps have passed already today. The prints overlap in chaotic patterns, narrow lines from children, broad tracks from livestock, and the deep, deliberate impressions of adults carrying heavy loads. You kneel for a moment and brush your gloved hand across a fresh set of marks. Someone walked this way only minutes before you arrived. The warmth of their presence is gone, but their weight remains etched into the ground. A soft murmur drifts from behind a stable wall, the low, rhythmic sound of a cow shifting inside its stall, exhaling a misty cloud into the frigid air. You catch the faint smell of hay, damp, cold, and slightly sweet. It mixes with the sharper scent of wood smoke, drifting from several chimneys, each emitting only the thinnest thread of grey. Fuel is scarce, and you can sense how carefully each household rations its warmth. A mainstream historical fact that settles into your thoughts is that many medieval villages relied almost entirely on stored summer firewood and dried peat. When winters stretched too long, fires burned smaller, lower, and dimmer, and you feel that dimness everywhere you look. You move deeper into the settlement, passing wicker fences, patched with whatever materials people could find, old cloth bits of leather, bundles of dried reeds. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some families hung fish bones or painted stones on their gates during cruel winters, believing they warded off wandering spirits of hunger. You see one such charm dangling from a string near a doorway, its shape clattering gently in the breeze. Whether you believe in its power or not, you understand the instincts behind it. Fear makes people inventive. You pause as you approach a small crossroads, where several houses gather around a communal well. Snow drifts across its circular stone lip, and you can see that villagers have carved narrow tracks leading up to it to prevent accidents. You crane your head over the edge and find the water far below its surface, partially frozen, but still visible. A rope hangs stiff and brittle, coated in tiny frozen beads. When you tap it lightly with your finger, it rings softly, like a dulled chime. Historians still argue whether wells like this remained usable throughout the harshest winters, or whether villages had to break through thick ice each morning to draw water. You glance at the faint crack spreading across the well's surface layer and suspect that reality probably depended on how lucky or unlucky each settlement was. This one looks like it hangs somewhere between the two. You straighten and continue on, allowing the village to unfold around you in slow, gentle details. A woman stands outside her doorway, beating a rug with a wooden paddle. The cloth releases small bursts of frost and dust into the air before she gives up and drapes it over a beam to stiffen in the cold. She nods at you, wrapped so tightly in wool that only her eyes show. Her breath fogs in front of her in slow pulses. Two boys chase each other across the snow-covered square, their laughter muted, as if the cold itself softened sound. They slip more than they run, sliding on patches of polished ice and landing with gentle thumps before scrambling up again. A moment later, a stern-looking older man calls to them, pointing them toward a shed where chores wait. The boys groan but obey, and you cannot help smiling slightly at their reluctant trudge. You pass by another home, where smoke curls lazily from a chimney. Through a narrow window, you glimpse the flicker of a small fire and the silhouette of someone stirring a pot. The smell that escapes a thin broth of root vegetables is mild but comforting. Hunger is everywhere here, not dramatic or loud, but steady, patient, and lingering. You feel it in the way people move, and in the way their shadows flicker across dimly lit rooms. A wooden cart sits abandoned near a stable, its wheels locked in place by frozen mud. You run your fingers along the rim and feel how hard and cold the wood has become. Someone has tried to wrap the axle in cloth to keep it from cracking, but the fabric has frozen solid, stiff enough to stand upright if pulled free. You imagine the struggle of trying to get this cart moving again, and you feel the weight of daily tasks growing heavier as the temperature drops. The village square widens ahead, revealing a long communal hall with a sagging roof and a row of shuttered windows. Light spills faintly from cracks around the door, and you hear low voices murmuring inside. Perhaps a group of villagers gathers there to share scraps of news or discuss plans to ration grain. A faint scent of ale escapes, thin, watery ale, brewed more for safety than for celebration. You consider stepping inside, but feel drawn instead to the quieter edges of the square. A cat darts out from behind a barrel, its fur puffed against the cold as it searches for mice. You hear it hiss softly when it detects your presence, then slip away with surprising speed. You watch its paw prints trail across the snow until they vanish under the eaves of a house. You pause as you feel the cold settle across your shoulders. Once again, its weight a reminder that even this brief shelter from the wind is temporary. The village, for all its small comforts, is still bound tightly to winter's grip. No amount of human warmth can fully soften that truth. A group of villagers emerges from a nearby doorway, 3 adults carrying baskets and bundles wrapped in cloth. One pauses to adjust her scarf, revealing cheeks flushed from indoor heat that barely holds. They nod politely as they pass you their steps, purposeful, their voices low. You catch only fragments of their conversation, something about stored rye, something about a missing sheep, something about the snow deepening along the north field. You follow them with your eyes until they disappear. Into another lane, their figures swallowed by drifting flakes. The quiet grows again, settling around you like a soft blanket that somehow carries both comfort and warning. You realize as you stand there that this village is doing what countless communities across Europe did during the winter of 1403, shrinking inward, conserving energy, tightening routines, and relying desperately on shared resilience. Life here does not stop, but it slows, narrows, and adapts. You take another slow breath, letting the cold air slip into your lungs as the village adjusts to your presence, and you adjust to its quiet, persistent rhythm. You slip into one of the small houses lining the village lane, pushing aside a heavy wool curtain that serves as a door. The air inside greets you with a muted wave of warmth, not enough to be called comfortable, but enough to soften the ache in your fingers. The room smells of wood smoke, damp wool, and the faint earthy sweetness of stored vegetables. You step forward, feeling the floorboards shift slightly under your boots. Everything here is worn, patched, and stretched thin, much like the people who keep it alive. A single hearth glows at the far wall, its flame no larger than a curled fist. The embers pulse gently, offering a reddish light that flickers across the rough timber beams overhead. You crouch near it, letting the faint heat touch your skin, as if the fire itself is shy about giving too much. One well-documented detail from this era is that most rural homes depended heavily on a central hearth, not only for warmth, but also for cooking, light, and even basic sanitation. Losing that fire, even for a few hours, could send a household spiraling into danger during a winter like this. You lean a little closer and notice how carefully the fuel has been arranged. A few narrow twigs, some strips of bark, a handful of peat crumbs pressed together like a fragile nest. The fire is kept deliberately small. Too much flame now would mean nothing left for tomorrow. Your breath moves gently across the embers, and for a moment they brighten, tossing up a tiny shower of sparks that dies almost instantly in the cold draft leaking through the walls. Your eyes adjust to the dimness, revealing details one by one. A pot hangs from a coarse iron hook, its bottom blackened, its contents simmering just enough to release a thin ribbon of steam. The scent suggests a mixture of cabbage, onion, and maybe a scrap of salted meat if the household is lucky. An adult might hope to stretch this pot over several meals. A child would hope the spoon scrapes deeply. You run your fingers across the rough stones around the hearth. They feel dry but cold, as if all their heat has been swallowed long ago. Someone has stuffed bits of moss and cloth into the cracks to keep out the wind. You notice the edges fraying, stiffened with frost. A lesser-known practice during severe winters involved packing animal hair or pulverized clay into wall gaps, creating a primitive but surprisingly effective insulation. Looking at this home, you wonder whether the family tried something similar or simply worked with whatever was closest at hand. A small wooden bench sits nearby, its surface worn smooth from years of use. On it rests a bundle of fire-starting tools, flint, steel, and a few strips of dried fungus used to catch sparks. You brush the edge of the flints with your thumb and feel the tiny grooves worn by countless strikes. It occurs to you that this simple, humble collection of tools might be the most valuable possessions in the entire house right now. A family moves quietly around you, two adults and a child, each performing small tasks that keep the home from slipping into chaos. The mother kneels beside the pot, stirring with slow, deliberate motions. The father arranges boots near the hearth to dry his fingers red and stiff. The child sits on a straw mat with a wooden toy, drawing patterns in the dust with the tip of a stick. Their movements feel soft and cautious, as though they're trying not to disturb the air too much. You catch the father glancing toward the ceiling. You follow his gaze and notice frost forming along the beams, white feathers slowly blooming across old wood. The cold creeping into the house is not just a nuisance, it is a reminder that this home is constantly negotiating with the winter outside. Records from the time describe how frost often spread inside houses during severe seasons, coating walls and ceilings, even when fires burned day and night. Seeing it now, you understand how easily warmth evaporates here. An odd little slice of medieval domestic life comes to mind. Some households hung small bags of herbs near the hearth, hoping the fragrance protected them from illness. You spot one now, a tiny faded cloth pouch tied with twine dangling just above the fire's glow. The scent has long vanished, but the hope tied into the knot remains. A cold draught sneaks under the door, swirling the smoke briefly. Everyone pauses when it happens. The mother instinctively reaches for a cloak resting nearby. The father adjusts a loose piece of wool trapped around the threshold. The child presses closer to the hearth, hugging their toy. In a place where warmth is rationed like treasure, even a small gust can feel like a threat. Opinions among modern scholars differ about just how effective these homes were at retaining heat. Some claim that medieval architecture was surprisingly resilient, designed to keep smoke and warmth hovering at the centre of the room. Others suggest that most homes leaked so badly that only constant fire kept temperatures bearable. You sit here now, feeling warmth on your face and cold brushing the back of your neck, and you suspect both interpretations might be true depending on the day. You glance at the pot again. The broth thickens subtly, releasing a faint bubble. The child's eyes follow it longingly. The mother dips a wooden ladle, tastes carefully, and adds a pinch of salt. The gesture is small, but carries weight, the kind of silent decision that determines how long the meal will stretch. In this winter flavour competes directly with survival. At the edge of the room, a pile of firewood rests in a neat stack. You move toward it and notice how little remains: a few slender logs and some brittle twigs. You imagine how many evenings this wood must serve, and the thought tightens your chest. The father follows your gaze and offers a small shrug, the kind that says, "It is what we have." A faint vibration hums through the wall as wind strengthens outside. Snow taps against the wooden beams, a rhythmic patter that makes the fire seem even smaller by comparison. The mother reaches out and gently shifts the pot to a hotter spot on the hook, trying to coax just a bit more warmth into the meal before the draft pulls it away again. You take a seat beside the hearth and extend your hands toward its glow. The heat is modest, shy, almost apologetic, but you welcome it all the same. It softens your fingertips, loosens your breath, and gives you a moment of respite from the relentless cold outside. Here in this dim room, the whole of winter seems distilled into one simple truth. Survival is made not of grand victories, but of small steady acts: tending fires, patching walls, stretching meals, sharing warmth. And tonight, as the flames flicker gently, you find yourself leaning into that truth, letting it wrap around you like the thinnest, warmest blanket. You step back into the open air, just as dawn tries without much success to brighten the sky. A dull grey light spreads reluctantly across the village, revealing shapes that look more like charcoal sketches than buildings. You follow a cluster of footprints toward the market square, the faint crunch of snow under your boots, echoing like slow, deliberate applause. Even in this cold, the market stirs. People do not have the luxury of waiting for warmer days. As you enter the square, you see wooden stalls arranged in a crooked ring, each one draped in cloth to shield its goods, or what little remains of them, from the wind. The cloth hangs stiff with frost edges, curled like brittle leaves. A few merchants stand behind their counters, blowing into their hands, stamping their feet, trying to keep blood flowing through fingers that must still count coins, no matter how numb they feel. The smells here are a tangle of cold air smoke and faint hints of food that once promised abundance. A fishmonger has only 2 small dried specimens, left curled and rigid like artifacts. A basket of onions nearby looks shrunken and tired. Bread sits in another stall, its crust cracked from days in the cold, more like stone than nourishment. One detail attested in surviving economic records is the way prices skyrocketed during severe winters. Even staples like grain could cost twice or 3 times their usual amount when transport slowed and harvests failed. You can feel that inflation in the tense glances exchanged between buyer and seller. A woman holds a small purse close to her chest, her fingers whitening as she counts each coin twice before handing them over for a sack of coarse flour. The merchant weighs it quickly, but you sense reluctance in the gesture. They cannot spare generous measures. Not now. The woman accepts the bag and tucks it beneath her cloak, her lips tightened by a combination of gratitude and fear. She nods to you as she passes, as if acknowledging that you understand the stakes of even the smallest purchase. You wander to another stall, where a bundle of herbs lies frozen together, the leaves fused by cold into an unbreakable clump. The merchant apologizes with a wry smile, explaining that the frost came too early this year. You run your finger across the icy surface and imagine how these herbs once smelled in summer alive and bright before winter locked them in this rigid silence. A curious tidbit from the era claims that some merchants used warm stones, or even their own breath, to soften herbs enough to sell, though the effect rarely lasted long. Looking at these frozen bundles, you can easily believe it. A sharp gust of wind sweeps through the square, rattling the wooden stalls and sending a cloud of frost swirling into the air. You pull your cloak tighter and glance around as the merchants lean inward, shielding their goods from the cold, as if the wind itself might steal them. The sound of creaking wood fills the space, punctuated by the occasional clack of coins exchanged with hesitant hands. A pair of farmers arrives with a small cart, its wheels wrapped in cloth to keep them from cracking. They unload what little they have, a few turnips, some wilted greens, and a bucket containing a stubborn chunk of frozen butter. The butter thuds onto the counter like a stone. Conflicting notes from medieval chroniclers suggest that farmers either hoarded goods during harsh winters or rushed them to market in hopes of trading for necessities. Watching these men, you can see threads of truth in both ideas woven together by sheer necessity. A dog trots past you, sniffing eagerly at dropped crumbs and discarded leaves. Its tail wags with a desperate energy, and you watch as it noses through a patch of snow until it finds a stray bone gnawed nearly clean. It trots away proudly, leaving tiny paw prints that crisscross the square like stitched embroidery. A commotion rises near the grain stall. A tense conversation voices sharp with the brittle edge of stress. A man pleads for an extra measure, insisting his family is ill. The grain seller shakes his head, palms raised in apology rather than anger. You can see the conflict on his face, the desire to help weighed against the fear of having nothing left for his own. The argument dissolves eventually into a quiet nod, the man accepting his allotment with trembling hands. You hear footsteps behind you. A young girl approaches, carrying a woven basket lined with cloth. She studies the vegetables on display with silent calculation, choosing each piece carefully, as if each one holds the shape of her family's next few days. When she finally selects a handful of wilted greens, she holds them gently as if they are rare treasures. Her breath hangs in the air like small grey feathers. You walk toward the centre of the market, where a large fire pit usually burns during festivals. Today, only a few embers glow within it, and even those struggle to survive the cold. You crouch beside it and feel barely any heat at all. The villagers who pass you exchange small glances, each one silently, acknowledging the strangeness of a winter too harsh even for flame. A faint ringing sound catches your attention, the steady clink of metal. You turn to see a blacksmith sharpening a blade on a grindstone, his breath forming thick clouds around him. His forge sits near the edge of the square, but even its fire sputters in the cold, requiring constant feeding. You watch sparks dance briefly before dying in midair, swallowed by the chill. He nods at you, then returns to his work, his movements slow and methodical. The market continues. In this rhythm, cautious transactions, measured voices, resigned faces. People move with the quiet determination of those who understand that survival depends on maintaining routine, even when routine becomes painfully difficult. A woman barters a wool scarf for a pouch of dried beans. A man trades a carved wooden spoon for a small candle stub. Every exchange feels weighted, deliberate, like pieces of a fragile puzzle being moved into place. You pause near a stall selling tallow candles, thick, uneven, and smelling faintly of smoke. The merchant explains that making more has become nearly impossible, Animals must live through winter before their fat can be used. You lift one candle and feel how light it is, how quickly it will burn. You imagine lighting it on a dark night and watching it melt away, hour by hour, a shrinking line between warmth and darkness. As the morning wears on, the sky brightens slightly, though without any real warmth. Snowflakes drift lazily from above, settling onto the goods and the people alike. No one seems surprised. The merchants simply brush the flakes away and continue with their day. You take one last slow walk around the market, absorbing its quiet resilience. Despite the cold, despite the scarcity, despite the uncertainty, life continues in cautious steps. People negotiate, trade, adapt. They gather what they can share, what they must, and protect whatever remains of the season's meagre bounty. And as you move out of the square and toward the next stretch of winter, you carry the faint hum of the market with you, a fragile melody of survival played out in small offerings and even smaller comforts. You follow a narrow lane that angles gently upward toward the manor house, overlooking the village, its stone walls rising from the snow like the ribs of some ancient creature weathered by centuries of storms. The path is lined with hedges trimmed back so tightly that even frost has trouble clinging to their branches. As you walk, your boots sink into a mixture of packed snow and frozen mud, each step slow and deliberate. The air feels strangely still here, as if sound itself becomes more respectful in the presence of noble walls. When you reach the gate, you pass beneath a carved wooden arch depicting vine's leaves and a pair of birds locked in a perpetual song. Their features have softened under years of cold, the details melting into a gentle blur. You brush your gloved fingers along the carving and feel tiny grains of ice lodged in its grooves. A servant opens the gate with a quiet nod, bundled so fully in wool that only their eyes show. They motion for you to step inside the manor yard, where snow lies, in neat pathways cleared with careful precision. The manor looms ahead, tall, stern, and dignified despite the winter pressing against its walls. Smoke rises from a single chimney, narrow and hesitant, as though the household reserves its warmth even here. A chronicled detail from aristocratic households of this era mentions how noble families frequently rationed fuel, just as strictly as peasants when winters cut deep. Even wealth could not banish cold, only negotiate with it in slightly more comfortable rooms. As you enter the main hall, the shift in temperature is noticeable but faint. The room is dimly lit, warmed by a long hearth where logs burn in small conservative flames. A row of tapestries covers portions of the stone walls, their threads depicting hunts, feasts, and mythical beasts. The colours, once vibrant now, appear muted by age and cold. A gentle draught whispers through the space, lifting the edges of the tapestries like slow-moving wings. Servants move quietly between tables, preparing for the manor's Christmas feast. The mood is not festive, so much as dutiful, everyone working with calm, practiced motions. You watch as a woman places a tray of trenchers on a long wooden table. The bread is thin, dense, and clearly stretched from limited stores. Nearby, a man arranges a scattering of dried fruits into a silver bowl, though their number seems too small for the display. You sense an underlying tension, the desire to uphold tradition while concealing the shortages that gnaw at even the wealthiest homes. An unusual practice preserved in household records notes that during harsh winters, nobles sometimes requested their cooks to dilute wines with warm water, disguising shortage as refinement. You notice a pot simmering near the hearth, releasing a faint aroma of warmed spices and something sweet, perhaps honey. It carries a hint of comfort, though you suspect its purpose is as much symbolic as practical. In a hall, this cold symbolism matters. A young servant sweeps the floor, pushing aside bits of straw dust and stray snowflakes that cling to boots. Each brush of the broom echoes across the room in soft, rhythmic strokes. Another servant polishes a pewter goblet with a cloth so worn it barely glints in the firelight. Their breath curls in pale spirals as they work. Even here, with all its quiet elegance, the chill finds every gap. Different scholarly interpretations exist about how well aristocratic households insulated their halls. Some argue that tapestries and thick rushes on the floor held heat surprisingly well. Others suggest that these measures offered more decoration than insulation. Feeling the uneven warmth on your face, you imagine the truth lies somewhere between those opinions. The fire warms the front of your body, while the cold nibbles at your heels. A steward enters the hall with a parchment in hand, glancing at the preparations with a furrowed brow. You sense his thoughts: what to serve first, how to make modest portions appear plentiful, how to keep spirits from sinking during a celebration meant to uplift. He gives instructions in low tones, his voice a steadying force in the room. The servants adjust their tasks accordingly, shifting from table to hearth and back again. You step closer to the hearth and feel the gentle warmth cling to your hands. Behind the flames, an iron pot hangs, suspended, its contents bubbling quietly. A scent of herbs rises from it, rosemary perhaps, or thyme, filling the hall with a subtle whisper of greenery that no longer exists outside these walls. A bowl of salted fish sits nearby, their surfaces slightly frosted from storage. The contrast between the steaming pot and the frozen fish captures the strangeness of noble feasts during winters of scarcity. A pair of children runs into the hall, cheeks flushed from playing outside. They dart between servants, chasing each other in circles until a watchful nurse catches them by the sleeves. She scolds gently, ushering them toward a quiet corner, where a small fire glows beneath a hooded chimney. They settle reluctantly, casting glances toward the preparations with wide, curious eyes. At the far end of the hall, a table displays the household's prized candlesticks, tall, slender, and made of polished brass. But you notice that only a few thin candles sit within them. The steward adjusts their placement, seeking to create the illusion of abundance. A noted observation from letters of the time reveals that noble families often lit fewer candles than tradition demanded during harsh years, rationing luxury in ways that appeared intentional rather than desperate. A soft murmur draws your attention to the doorway. A knight enters, snow falling from his cloak as he brushes it aside. His armour beneath looks dull from cold patches of frost clinging to the metal. He exchanges brief words with the steward, likely discussing security along the manor's borders or the condition of the roads. The conversation remains low and measured, practical concerns wrapped in formal tone. You watch all of this unfold: the subdued bustle, the quiet struggle to maintain dignity, the subtle shifts in expression that reveal hope and worry mingled together. The manor does not sparkle with excess or celebration. Instead, it gently holds together the threads of routine, tradition, and restraint. As you prepare to leave the hall, you pause by one of the tapestries. You notice something woven into the border, a small embroidered star, barely visible unless you look closely. Perhaps the seamstress added it as a sign of luck or devotion, or perhaps it's simply an ornament of beauty to soften the starkness of stone walls and icy air. Whatever its purpose, the tiny star offers a moment of gentleness before you step back into the winter outside, where frost waits patiently to reclaim the warmth you've borrowed. You make your way toward the village church, a squat stone building crouched at the far end of the lane, its shape softened by layers of drifting snow. The roof sags slightly under the weight, the thatch trapped beneath an icy shell that glitters faintly in what little daylight filters through the clouds. As you approach, you hear a soft, rhythmic tapping, the sound of frost cracking along the eaves as the building adjusts to the relentless cold. The church feels less like a place of grandeur and more like a shelter stubbornly resisting the season. When you step inside, the air greets you with a peculiar mix of chill and warmth, the faint heat from clustered bodies, the sharp bite of cold stone, the glow of candles fighting to push back shadows. Your boots scrape softly across the floor as they brush over a thin layer of straw laid down to soften footsteps and trap what little warmth the room can hold. The scent of smoke hangs close to the rafters, mingling with the earthy smell of wet wool from the villagers gathered within. You draw in a long breath, letting the atmosphere settle around you like a thick, hushed blanket. Several people kneel near the altar, hands clasped, their voices barely above whispers. The priest stands nearby, his breath visible as he speaks, a faint grey cloud that dissolves in the cold. He moves slowly, carefully, as if each gesture risks disturbing the fragile heat hovering around the candles. Period accounts mention that winter services during years like this often took place in near darkness, with only a handful of candles lit to spare precious tallow. You can see that truth flickering in front of you now, tiny flames dancing atop slender wax columns, their light trembling under every draught. Your eyes drift upward. Frost has crept inside the church, crawling along the stone walls in delicate patterns that resemble feathers or tree branches. You run your finger along one of these frozen designs and feel it melt instantly against your skin. The cold inside this building is not a passing inconvenience, it is a presence persistent and intrusive. People huddle together, not only in reverence, but also to share warmth, their shoulders touching lightly, their breaths forming a shared cloud of survival. You find a bench along the wall and sit for a moment, absorbing the scene. A curious scrap of medieval belief drifts through your mind. In some regions, parishioners considered candle smoke, rising in a straight, steady line, to be a sign of divine favour during winter. You watch one candle now and see the flames stretch upward before wavering slightly, shuddering, when a gust sneaks through the cracks in the stone. The villagers seem accustomed to these interruptions. They barely pause in their prayers. At the front of the church, two women adjust a cloth draped over the altar, a faded piece of embroidered linen edges, frayed but still decorated with intricate vines. They smooth it carefully, positioning it so the embroidered cross rests exactly in the centre. Their hands tremble slightly from cold, but their movements remain steady. From surviving church inventories, we know that many parishes relied on just one or two fine cloths for winter mass, often repaired repeatedly over generations. You can see those layers of care stitched into this cloth, each mend telling a small story of hands determined to preserve beauty amid hardship. A soft cough echoes across the room, followed by another. The sound seems amplified by the stone, reminding everyone present how fragile health becomes in a season like this. A murmured prayer shifts slightly in tone, carrying a plea for protection. You watch as a man crosses himself slowly, his lips moving silently, his shoulders rising and falling with each careful breath. His cloak hangs stiff around him, frost clinging to its edges where his body heat has not reached. Toward the back, a group of children sit perched on a narrow bench. Their bright eyes scan the room, darting between candles' shadows and the faint outlines of religious figures carved along the walls. One child presses their hands together and blows into them, rubbing vigorously to chase away the numbness. Another lifts the hem of their tunic to warm their fingers against their stomach. Censuses and parish records from the early 15th century hint that winter church attendance often included entire families seeking not only spiritual comfort, but also a brief escape from their colder homes. Watching these children shift restlessly, you can see why. The priest steps forward, lifting a small book whose pages look stiff from moisture. He begins to read in a low, steady voice. The words flow through the church like a thin stream of water running through snow, quiet but persistent. The congregation leans in slightly, as though trying to absorb both the meaning and the warmth of the sound. Interpretations of how sermons were delivered in such cold spaces vary among historians, with some suggesting shortened liturgy, while others argue that priests continued full rites regardless of weather. Listening now, you suspect this priest chooses a middle path, faithful to tradition, mindful of frostbitten toes. A breeze slips in through the door as someone enters late, sending a sweep of cold spiraling through the room. Candles flicker violently. A few go out, leaving thin curls of smoke, rising like fading prayers. The newcomer closes the door quickly, lowering their head in silent apology as they take a place near the wall. The congregation shifts, but no one complains. This is simply how winter behaves. Everyone accepts it with a weary patience. You notice a carving near your seat, a small depiction of a lamb etched into the wood. Its lines are simple, almost childlike. Perhaps a local craftsman carved it generations ago, or perhaps it was meant to comfort the youngest worshippers. You trace the outline lightly with your glove and feel the warmth of the gesture linger. The service continues quietly, a gentle rhythm of murmured prayers and slow breaths. The candles offer only the smallest reprieve from the cold, but their glow casts a soft halo on the faces around you. The mixture of flickering light and drifting shadows creates an atmosphere that feels both sacred and fragile, like a moment suspended between endurance and hope. When the priest finally closes his book, a hush settles over the room. People rise slowly, joint-stiff garments rustling softly. No triumphant ending, no jubilant hymn, just a shared moment of resilience, housed within old stone walls. As they file toward the exit, their footsteps create a soft procession of sound, each person carrying both the weight of winter and the faint comfort offered here. You linger for a final moment, letting the quiet seep into you. The church may be cold, dim and worn, but something about it feels steady, a place where warmth exists not in temperature, but in congregation. When you finally step outside, snowflakes swirl down gently, and the chill greets you like an old acquaintance. You pull your cloak tighter and continue on, carrying with you the echo of whispered prayers that linger in the air long after the door closes. You walk away from the quiet hush of the church and step back into the brittle morning air. Your breath curls upward in pale ribbons as you make your way along the lane, following the faint uneven paths that branch toward the cottages, clustered at the village's heart. As you draw closer, a new kind of sound drifts through the cold, low coughs, shuffling steps, murmured voices, tinged with worry. The winter has settled, not only on rooftops, but also inside people's lungs, bones and blood. Illness moves quietly here, like a shadow that keeps slipping under doors, no matter how tightly families seal them. You push aside a curtain hanging over one doorway and step into the dim glow of a cottage. The air hits you with a mix of warmth, steam, and the unmistakable scent of sickness, damp cloth, heated herbs, and something metallic that lingers just beneath the surface. A pot simmers weakly over the hearth, its contents a watery broth meant as both food and medicine. Beside it, a woman sits hunched over a small stool, wringing out a cloth she dips again and again into a bowl of warm water. Her hands tremble from fatigue, but her movements are steady as she presses the cloth to the forehead of a bundled figure lying on a straw-stuffed mattress. The child beneath the blankets breathes in shallow, uneven pulls. Their cheeks are flushed with fever, though their hands remain pale and cold. You crouch beside them and listen to the faint crackling sound of their breath. Writings from local healers of the period describe how winters like these often brought waves of respiratory illness, coughs that lingered for weeks, fevers that rose and receded unpredictably, and chills that sank deep enough to make bones ache. You feel the truth of those accounts now settling into the stillness of the room. Herbs hang from the rafters, overhead bundles of rosemary, thyme, yarrow, and a few dried flowers whose colours have long since faded. A curious fragment of folk practice comes to mind. Some households believed that hanging bunches of lavender above a sickbed encouraged evil humours to drift upward and leave the body. You look at the bundles and wonder whether this family clings to the same hope, or whether the herbs are simply there because they have always been there, a reminder of warmer seasons. The mother lifts her gaze to you briefly. Her eyes are red, not from crying, but from watching over the child through the night. She returns her attention to the bowl, stirring it slowly before dipping another cloth. You notice her lips moving in what might be a whispered prayer or perhaps a list of remedies she hopes to try next. Illness narrows a home's world to the smallest tasks, turning each breath into an uncertain waiting. Nearby, an older man sits with his back against the wall, wrapped in a cloak that reaches his chin. He shivers occasionally, even though he keeps close to the hearth. His cough is deeper than the child's, more ragged, cutting through the room, like a sudden gust of cold air. He presses a cloth to his mouth, each time a silent attempt to contain the sickness. He offers you a faint nod, then closes his eyes, sinking into the kind of exhausted rest that is never quite sleep. The healer of the village arrives moments later, stepping inside with a satchel slung over her shoulder. She carries an assortment of tools and remedies vials of infused oil, bundles of dried bark, a small mortar for grinding substances into powders. She moves with quiet efficiency, her presence steady but not unkind. Records from scattered parish logs hint at village healers walking tirelessly from home to home through severe winters, their knowledge both respected and limited. Watching her now, you understand how heavily a community relies on someone like her. She kneels beside the child and places a hand on their chest, counting the breaths with a focused expression. Then she opens her satchel and selects a small bundle of crushed juniper, mixing it into a bowl of warm water. The aroma rises almost instantly, sharp, clean, and unexpectedly comforting. She instructs the mother to hold the bowl close to the child's face, letting the steam ease their breathing. The mother obeys, adjusting the blanket with careful hands. As the room fills with the scent of juniper, you glance toward the narrow window near the door. Frost has crept inward, across the glass, creating swirling patterns that glisten faintly in the dim light. You run your fingers along the window frame and feel the cold seeping through. Some scholars disagree on how well medieval homes could retain heat during winters like this. Examining the wavering frost on the inside of the window, you suspect the answer changes, depending on the day. The healer turns her attention to the older man, offering him a cup filled with a mixture of warm ale and crushed herbs. He grimaces at the bitterness, but drinks slowly. When he finishes, he sets the cup down carefully, as though afraid he might drop it. His cough eases slightly, and the healer watches him with a professional calm. You sense the weight she carries, the responsibility for so many lives with so few tools at her disposal. A small table near the hearth holds items laid out with deliberate order, a spool of linen for bandages, a jar of honey used to soothe throats, a small knife for cutting herbs. A candle burns beside them, its flame wavering in the draught. The honey glows softly in the candlelight, and you remember reading that medieval households often valued honey as both medicine and luxury. In a winter like this, its sweetness becomes more than flavour. It becomes hope spread thin but carefully. The healer eventually rises to leave, offering final instructions to the family. She steps outside into the cold with quiet determination, already bracing for the next home, waiting for her attention. You watch her disappear into swirling flakes of snow, her figure slowly blending into the winter landscape. Inside the cottage, the child's breathing steadies for a moment. The mother exhales softly, her shoulders lowering in cautious relief. The man closes his eyes again, leaning more fully into the warmth of the hearth. The pot continues to simmer, each bubble rising like a small promise of continuity. You sit with them a little longer, absorbing the mixture of fear and resilience held within these walls. Illness is not a stranger here. It is an expected visitor, unwelcome, yet familiar. But the people living through this winter do not surrender easily. They brew herbs, warm water share, blankets, whisper prayers into the cold air, and keep moving through each day with quiet persistence. When you finally stand to leave, you feel the warmth of the hearth slip away instantly, replaced by the sharp sting of outside air. The curtain falls behind you, leaving the family wrapped in their small circle of light. You tighten your cloak and continue on, carrying with you the subtle ache of their struggle and the faint, stubborn spark of their hope. You continue along a narrow path that winds past the outer edge of the village, where homes give way to open fields, buried beneath a thick, unbroken mantle of snow. The landscape stretches out in muted shades of white and grey, the horizon softened by drifting flakes that fall in slow, steady silence. You stop for a moment and inhale the cold air, feeling it settle inside your lungs like a fragile sheet of ice. The fields look deserted at first glance, but as you step farther, faint movements reveal the quiet persistence of those who still tend this land despite the season's brutal grip. A lone farmer trudges across the snow shoulders, hunched leading a small group of sheep whose wool is dusted with frost. They move reluctantly, lifting their legs high to break through the crusted surface. You walk beside him for a while, listening to the soft crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional bleat carried on the wind. The farmer nods to you, his breath appearing in steady bursts. According to agricultural notes found in estate records from this period, tending livestock during midwinter was a daily struggle. Animals needed constant care to avoid freezing, starving, or wandering off in search of forage hidden beneath ice. Watching these sheep now nudging at patches of ground, too frozen to yield anything, you see that struggle etched into every step. The farmer leads the animals to a low wooden shed at the field's edge. The structure leans slightly, as though winter has worn down its resolve. Inside you see a meagre supply of hay piled against one wall. He brushes snow from his shoulders and tosses a few armfuls toward the sheep, who gather eagerly, their noses buried in the pale strands. He runs a rough hand across one animal's back, checking its warmth. His expression, a mix of worry and habit. You glance toward the hay pile and notice how little remains, barely enough to last a week. He meets your eyes briefly, offering a tight smile that says more than words could. Behind the shed, a small pen holds two cows huddled close together, their breath rising in thick, warm clouds. One stamps the ground, repeatedly impatient or cold. The other lowers its head toward a shallow trough, frozen into a solid block. The farmer chips at the ice with a wooden mallet each strike, sending sharp cracks through the air. Notes preserved in manorial rolls describe how animals often suffer dehydration during harsh winters, not from lack of water, but from water locked away in impenetrable ice. As you watch the farmer work, splintering the surface piece by piece, you understand how vital and exhausting this daily duty must be. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of damp earth trapped beneath layers of snow. You kneel and brush aside a small patch of frost, revealing the dark soil beneath. It feels cold enough to bite your fingertips. A curious observation from medieval herbal texts claims that some farmers believed the earth slept during winter, storing its strength for spring's arrival. You look across the frozen fields and imagine that quiet slumber stretching beneath the surface, patient and unmoved by human worry. Further along, you spot two villagers clearing snow from a series of simple wooden frames arranged in rows. These frames once supported late-season vegetables, cabbage leeks, and hardy greens capable of surviving mild frost. Now they stand nearly buried, their protective coverings torn by wind and ice. You walk closer and see the villagers lifting wilted leaves from beneath the snow, inspecting them with practiced eyes. Some they keep, others they discard. From scattered accounts of rural life, we know that winter gleaning like this often meant the difference between endurance and hunger. Any vegetable that survived the cold, no matter how small or pale, offered hope. One villager lifts a shriveled turnip triumphantly, brushing off the attached ice crystals, before placing it in a basket. It is a modest victory, but he smiles as if it were treasure. You find yourself smiling in return, understanding that winter shrinks expectations until even the smallest discovery becomes reason for gratitude. A short walk away, the remains of a small orchard stand, silent bare branches stretching upward like pleading hands. Apples once hung here in late autumn, but now the trees hold only frost, their bark cracked in long shallow lines. You place a gloved hand against one trunk and feel its coldness seep into your palm. Conflicting interpretations in estate documents suggest that orchards either endured winters fairly well or suffered significant die-off during extreme freezes. Examining the brittle branches, you suspect this one belongs to the latter category. You notice movement near a low stone wall bordering the orchard. A young woman crouches there, carefully lifting clumps of snow to reveal stored vegetables buried beneath layers of straw. She works with gentle precision, brushing away frost to check the condition of each root. When she finds one that has survived the cold, she tucks it into a basket. When she finds one ruined by rot or freeze, she sets it aside with a sigh. The technique she uses, underground storage, insulated by straw, appears in various agricultural manuals of the era as a clever method for preserving produce through harsh months. Seeing it in action now gives you a glimpse of the ingenuity that thrives even in bleak conditions. A raven circles overhead, its dark wings stark against the pale sky. It lands atop a fence post and watches you with sharp, unblinking eyes. The farmer glances at the bird and mutters something under his breath. In some corners of medieval Europe, ravens were seen as signs of ill omen during winter, a belief captured in snippets of folklore that described them as harbingers of sickness or hunger. You watch as the raven tilts its head, then takes flight again, its wings cutting through the cold air with effortless grace. You continue through the fields, your feet sinking into snow that varies between soft powder and hardened crust. Each step reveals more about how people cling to the land, even when the land gives little in return. A wooden fence lies partially collapsed beneath the weight of snow, its rails bent like tired limbs. A lone figure in the distance repairs another fence, hammering new pegs into place with stiff, reddened hands. The rhythm of his work carries a quiet determination, as though he is patching not just wood, but the fragile boundary between order and winter's encroachment. As you near the village again, you pass a frozen stream cutting through the fields. The ice is thick, opaque, and dusted with frost, but you can still sense the faint movement of water trapped beneath. You crouch and lay your palm on the surface, feeling the subtle vibrations. The cold numbs your fingers instantly, but you keep them there a moment longer, imagining the life waiting below, biding its time. A final gust of wind sweeps across the landscape, bending the dry grasses, poking through snow, and sending tiny crystals swirling into the air. You stand, pull your cloak close, and look back over the fields. Despite their stillness, they feel alive quietly, enduring quietly, preparing quietly, holding a promise that this winter, harsh as it is, will eventually loosen its grip. And as you walk away, you carry that promise with you, a small ember of warmth tucked deep inside the cold. You follow the path leading out of the fields and into open country where the wind roams freely and the sky seems to press downward with its own heavy stillness. As you walk, the pale morning light dims yet again, swallowed by rolling clouds that gather along the horizon like a slow-moving army. You pause for a moment, sensing the shift in the air, soft at first, then sharp, then unmistakably threatening. Snow begins to fall in small hesitant flakes, drifting lazily before picking up speed, their descent growing tighter and more urgent. You pull your cloak close, bracing for the moment when the world around you decides to turn wild. Within minutes, the snowfall intensifies. Flakes thicken, swirling sideways, as gusts of wind slice across the open ground. The once visible path ahead dissolves into a white blur that forces you to squint. Your boots sink deeper, with every step the snow rising up your ankles, then your shins until each movement feels like lifting a weight. You lean forward, trying to shield your face, as the wind grows ferocious. You can hear it now, not a gentle whisper, but a low, restless howl that seems to come from every direction at once. Chroniclers from the period describe storms so sudden and fierce that travellers lost their bearings within moments, swallowed by snow that blotted out all familiar shapes. You feel that truth settle around you now, as the landscape disappears beneath waves of drifting white. The hedgerows, the fence lines, even the distant cottages you passed earlier, everything vanishes into a storm that feels intent on erasing the world. The wind lashes your cloak, tugging violently, until you brace your feet to keep from staggering backward. Snow sweeps across the ground in rippling patterns, forming ridges that shift faster than your eyes can track. The storm becomes a living thing, moaning, swirling, roaring its breath cold enough to sting your teeth. It presses against your chest, making each inhale shallow and effortful. Somewhere above the storm's howl, you hear the crack of a tree limb snapping under the weight of accumulating ice. The sound slices through the chaos like a warning. You jerk your head upward, though the sky's little more than a churning blur. Snow finds every gap in your clothing, melting briefly before turning to chill again. Tiny crystals cling to your lashes and blur your vision until the world becomes a shimmering smear. Amid the storm's fury, an old belief surfaces in your thoughts. Villagers once claimed that winter storms carried restless spirits who prowled the night, searching for travelers to confuse. Whether or not you're inclined to believe such things, you understand why people did. Nothing about this storm feels natural or predictable. Everything about it feels personal. You stumble forward blindly aware that standing still would be more dangerous than continuing. The wind presses so hard against your back that you nearly fall to your knees. You stretch your arms out slightly, using instinct rather than vision to guide your steps. Somewhere beneath the layers of sound, you think you hear faint bells, perhaps from livestock, perhaps from a distant cottage. But the storm swallows the sound almost instantly, leaving only the relentless rasp of wind and snow. Visibility drops to only a few feet. The snow thickens until it becomes a wall of white, obscuring even your own hands. The ground beneath you shifts unpredictably, some patches soft, others hardened into icy ridges that catch your boots. Contemporary travelers' accounts mention the terror of blind storms, when the world disappeared so completely that people could not distinguish up from down, path from ditch. You feel that disorientation now, as your sense of direction twists uncomfortably inside your chest. You crouch low, trying to steady yourself. A sudden gust slams into you, harsh enough to send a spray of icy needles across your face. You taste cold metal on your tongue. You grip a small outcropping of rock, more ice than stone, and let its solidity anchor you for a breath. Snow piles on your shoulders, in moments turning your cloak heavy, weighted as if winter is trying to pull you into the ground. Another belief from rural folklore flits through your mind. It was said that if you spoke aloud during a storm, the wind could steal your voice and carry it away, leaving you breathless for days. Whether born of superstition or caution, the idea makes sense now. Speaking would feel defiant, almost foolish in the presence of something so overpowering. You push onward, moving in short, deliberate bursts between pauses. Each step requires effort, lifting your feet through snow that rises nearly to your knees at times. Your muscles ache. Your fingers feel stiff inside your gloves, and though you flex them repeatedly, the warmth refuses to return. You keep your head lowered, following the faint curve of the land beneath your boots, trusting that the path still exists somewhere under this shifting white ocean. Somewhere in the gusts, you think you hear the creak of a wooden signpost. You turn, squinting hard, and glimpse a dark, vertical shape, half buried in snow. You reach it with slow, careful steps. When your hand finally touches the rough wood, relief floods you. Landmarks still exist. The world has not vanished entirely. The post leans at an angle, shaking with each blast of wind, its surface coated in frost. You brush it with your glove and feel the vibrations of the storm humming through it. The wind changes direction, suddenly swirling around you in a tight circular motion. Snow lifts from the ground, in spirals, writhing like a living creature. Your cloak flaps violently, nearly torn from your grip. You cling to the signpost until the gust subsides. The storm shifts again, its energy unpredictable, its temper almost sentient. You have seen snowfall before, but this feels like winter, throwing a tantrum. Experts studying medieval climate patterns often note that extreme weather events during the early 15th century appeared more frequently than in previous generations. Records describe winters filled with storms that arrived without warning, leaving villages isolated for days. You understand now how such events shaped entire communities, how they defined routines, reinforced fears, and carved their presence into memory. You gather your strength and begin moving again, using the signpost as a starting point. The storm continues its assault, but you sense the faintest loosening at its edges. The wind still fierce, but slightly less coordinated in its strikes. Snow still falls thickly, but the flakes seem larger now, slower, as though exhaustion has reached even the storm itself. You trudge forward until the vague outline of a building emerges ahead, A barn or a cottage, its shape blurred but unmistakably human-made. Relief pulses through your chest. You push toward it, each step a small victory, until finally your hand touches wood. You lean into the wall, catching your breath as the storm continues to roar behind you. For now, you are sheltered. For now, the storm rages outside while you stand within the fragile boundary of a structure built to endure nights exactly like this. And as the wind howls around it, you understand why survival in a winter like this depends not on strength alone, but on persistence, on the willingness to keep moving step by step through the storm that will not end. You rest your weight against a rough wooden wall for a moment, letting the worst of the storm's fury slip past you like a beast that has lost interest. When your breathing steadies, you step around the corner of the building and approach the entrance, pushing gently against a half-frozen door. It groans in protest, but relents just enough for you to slip inside. The sudden shift from the storm's roar to the muffled quiet of shelter feels jarring, as though you've stumbled into a pocket of stillness, hidden inside the tumult. The interior is dim lit only by a few embers glowing at the base of a small fire pit. You blink until your vision adjusts, revealing figures huddled close together, travellers who like you sought refuge when the storm struck. Their cloaks hang heavily from their shoulders, soaked at the hem, stiff with frost where the wind bit hardest. Some sit on overturned crates, others crouch near the embers, extending their hands toward the fading heat. One man nods as you enter, shifting slightly to make room. His face is lined with exhaustion, not age, and his beard sparkles faintly with frost. Beside him, a woman adjusts a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, tugging it close to conceal the trembling in her hands. Her boots sit near the fire pit, steaming faintly as the ice melts. A few feet away, a young boy clings to the side of a large mule, its breath misting heavily, warming the boy's cheek each time it exhales. The smell in the shelter is a mingling of wet wool, damp wood, and animal warmth, an unexpectedly comforting blend compared to the sharp metallic cold outside. The travellers shift slightly, acknowledging your arrival without speaking, as though sound itself feels too heavy to disturb the fragile calm. A man near the back clears his throat softly and murmurs something about waiting until the storm lessens. His voice is gentle but hoarse, the kind that suggests long days of travel and too many cold nights spent outdoors. From fragments preserved in travellers' logs, we know that inns and shelters along major routes often filled quickly during harsh winters, with strangers sharing space out of necessity rather than familiarity. The scene before you mirrors those accounts, people united not by friendship but by weather. Someone stirs the embers with a piece of broken branch, coaxing a brief flare of orange light. The glow reveals more faces, 2 merchants with bulging satchels, a pair of older women whose cloaks are dotted with melted snow, a pilgrim wearing a carved wooden token around his neck, symbol of the shrine he's journeying toward. Each person watches the fire with the same quiet hope, as if willing it to burn just a little brighter. A curious detail from wayfarers' tales resurfaces in your memory. Many travellers carried small pouches of dried herbs to sprinkle into fire pits, believing certain scents kept misfortune away during winter journeys. You notice one of the older women now reaching into her cloak. She tosses a pinch of powdered rosemary onto the embers. A fragrant puff rises into the air, filling the space with an herbal warmth that seems to settle everyone's nerves. A few heads bow in silent gratitude. Wind rattles the wooden shutters, reminding you of the world beyond the shelter. Snow pushes against the cracks, sifting in thin lines across the floor. One traveller rises to block the gaps with rags, muttering that the storm is far from finished. Scholars examining early travel routes have long noted that shelters like this were never meant to withstand the worst of winter. They served merely as temporary havens, fragile but essential. Watching snow creep across the floor, you understand the balance between safety and vulnerability that defines such spaces. The pilgrim near the fire uncrosses his legs and leans forward, offering a soft greeting. His voice carries the quiet conviction of someone accustomed to long roads. He tells you he has been walking for nearly a week, hoping to reach a distant abbey before Christmas. His hands tremble lightly as he warms them. He admits he had not expected the storm to arrive so fiercely. You nod, feeling that same surprise, lingering in your own bones. The boy beside the mule begins humming a simple tune, the kind passed from child to child, until no one remembers who first sang it. His voice is thin but steady, threading through the silence like a warm thread. The melody prompts one of the merchants to smile faintly. He pulls from his pack a small cloth pouch and offers the boy a scrap of dried fruit, a rare kindness in such a lean season. The boy accepts it with wide eyes, biting carefully, as though savouring each moment. A dispute breaks out quietly, near the rear of the shelter, not angry, just anxious. Two travellers discuss whether to venture onward or wait out the full storm. One insists the road cannot be trusted. Drifts will be too deep, paths too obscured. The other fears staying means losing precious daylight hours needed to reach the next safe place. Their voices rise only slightly, fading quickly when the wind howls again, drowning out all argument. Surviving records from medieval road networks describe this same tension, the fear of staying, the fear of going, both pressing equally hard during fierce weather. You find a place to sit near the embers, letting their heat seep slowly through your gloves. The fire crackles weakly, the wood nearly consumed. You shift a few unburned pieces closer, helping the flame catch. It answers with a small rush of warmth that ripples across the shelter. Several travellers glance your way, gratitude flickering in their expressions before they return to their thoughts. Someone offers a small loaf of dark bread, breaking off pieces to share. The loaf is dense and slightly stale, but its warmth, so recently taken from within a cloak, makes it feel more generous than any feast. You accept a piece, chewing slowly. The bread tastes of malt and smoke, with a hint of bitterness from the grain. It fills you enough to calm the tightness in your stomach. Snow continues to pile against the door, but the storm's rhythm shifts. The wind's roaring becomes more uneven, interrupted by long pauses, as if the world outside is catching its breath. Several heads lift at once, listening. The pilgrim murmurs that storms often weaken in cycles, offering brief windows of calm. Whether that is true or merely hopeful talk, you cannot tell. The shelter listens as one waiting for a sign. The mule snorts softly, shaking off frost. The boy presses close to its flank, stealing warmth. The merchants check their packs. The older women whisper prayers. Each person finds comfort in their own way, gathering patience as the storm slowly loosens its grip. You sit quietly, letting the fire warm your palms. The shelter holds a delicate peace. Strangers bound together by weather, sharing warmth, food and silence. Outside, the storm still growls, but within these walls the night feels a little less hostile. You know the journey must continue when the wind eases, but for now, this stolen moment of stillness becomes its own kind of refuge. You step back into the fading storm, once the wind slackens enough to make walking possible, and you follow a narrow track leading toward the dark silhouette rising above the village, a castle perched on a low hill, its walls outlined by drifting snow. The sky hangs heavy with clouds, but a faint silvery light breaks through in patches, catching on the castle's battlements, like the pale glint of old steel. As you approach, the air feels different here, still bitterly cold, but charged with a stern kind of order, as though discipline itself radiates from the stone. The path leading to the gates is flanked by deep drifts, where guards have trudged repeatedly, carving uneven trenches into the snow. You follow these paths upward, feeling the incline pull on your legs. With each step, the castle looms larger, its towers rising like frozen pillars against the grey sky. A pair of sentries stands beneath the gatehouse arch, their cloaks snapping in the wind, their breath swelling in thick clouds. They watch you approach with cautious eyes until one lifts a lantern, examining your features in the dim glow. When he decides you pose no threat, he steps aside, motioning for you to enter. Inside the outer bailey, the castle feels alive with muted activity. Chickens huddle beneath wooden awnings, their feathers puffed into round clusters. A blacksmith works beside a forge, that sputters against the cold, striking a glowing horseshoe with firm, rhythmic blows. The sparks scatter briefly before dying in the frigid air. According to surviving household roles, castles relied heavily on year-round labour to function properly. Smiths, cooks, stable hands, laundresses, all working in unison regardless of season. Watching them now, you notice how winter slows everything without stopping it entirely. You move toward the inner ward where a stone staircase curves upward along the wall. Snow clings to each step, turning the climb into a cautious, deliberate effort. When you reach the top, the view opens into a courtyard, bustling with subdued motion. Servants haul buckets of water from a well partially frozen over chipping at the rim before lowering the rope. 2 guards practice with wooden staves their movements, slower than usual, but still sharp, punctuated by the crack of wood against wood. Every breath from every person hangs visible in the air. One corner of the courtyard houses the castle's kitchen, its doorway glowing with a faint orange light. Curious, you step inside and immediately feel the temperature shift, still cool, but noticeably warmer than the world outside. A long hearth dominates the room, flames licking up from beneath a cauldron large enough to bathe a child in. A cook bustles between tables, dusting flour onto dough, while another chops onions so quickly that their scent fills the room like a pungent fog. Household account books from the period often mention that castle kitchens doubled as warm refuges for servants during harsh winters. The moment you breathe in, you understand why. Nearby, a young scullion scrubs a pot with red-chapped hands. He pauses occasionally to warm his fingers over the fire before returning to his work. A curious glimpse into castle life reveals that scullions were often the youngest and most overworked members of the kitchen staff, sometimes sleeping near the hearth just to survive the coldest nights. The boy before you seems destined for exactly that fate. You continue deeper into the castle, drawn toward the great hall. When you enter, the space feels cavernous, its ceiling lost in shadow, above rows of wooden beams. Long tables stretch across the room, though only a few candles burn along their surfaces. A tapestry, depicting a battle scene, covers one wall, its colours muted, but still vivid enough to feel imposing. The hall is warmer than the courtyard, but still carries a lingering chill. The stone retains cold, even when fires burn. A small group sits near the hearth at the hall's far end, 3 guards warming their hands, a maid mending a torn sleeve, and a steward reviewing a parchment under the dim glow of a tallow candle. The steward looks up briefly, acknowledging you before returning to his work. The document in his hands likely tracks supplies, repairs or rations castle management. In winter required meticulous attention as provisions dwindled rapidly. Administrative notes from the era emphasize how winter demanded both strict discipline and creative adaptation from those responsible for maintaining order. As you watch the guards near the hearth, one of them removes his helmet, revealing hair stiff with frost. He massages his temples, wincing as warmth meets the cold metal's imprint on his skin. The other 2 speak softly about their patrols. Footprints glimpsed near the forest edge, a broken gate hinge that iced overnight, a wolf sighting by the river. Their voices carry the matter-of-fact tone of people accustomed to confronting winter's hazards as part of their daily duty. You wander toward a narrow staircase and ascend to the parapet. The wind greets you instantly, tugging at your cloak and stinging your cheeks. Up here, the world spreads out in all directions, fields buried in white clusters of cottages, the thin ribbon of a frozen stream. Smoke rises from the village chimneys, like faint signals while the last threads of the storm drift across the hills. You grip the cold stone parapet and feel how rough and unyielding it is beneath your gloves. Some modern historians disagree on just how drafty castle interiors were. Surviving structures suggest considerable variation depending on wealth design and maintenance. Standing here with the wind slicing past and slipping into every gap you imagine, that warmth was a privilege reserved for only the innermost chambers. The outer walls, no matter how thick, cannot silence the winter beyond them. You descend again, moving into a corridor lit by torches. Their flames quiver each time a draft sneaks through arrow slits. You hear footsteps echo faintly from somewhere deeper inside, perhaps a page running an errand or a knight returning from patrol. The corridor twists into a smaller chamber where blankets hang drying near a fire, their edges curling from heat. A servant tends the fire, stacking wood with careful precision. She glances at you as you enter, offering a weary but polite nod. A small shrine stands in the corner, an icon carved from pale wood, surrounded by melted candle stubs. Someone has placed a sprig of evergreen beneath it, perhaps carried in before the snows arrived. Such quiet, personal displays appear in inventories and letters from castle households, tiny offerings meant to bring protection during long winters. You touch the evergreen, gently feeling its needles still soft despite the cold. When you return to the courtyard, evening begins to settle. Torches are lit one by one, casting warm halos that shimmer against falling snow. Workers finish their tasks quickly, eager to retreat indoors. The castle grows quieter, but not empty. Its rhythms continue steady and disciplined, as they have for generations. You pause beneath the archway, letting the cold sink into your skin once more. The castle stands firm around you, weathered, weary, but resolute. A place built not for comfort, but for endurance. And tonight, as you step back into the darkening winter, you carry with you the sense of a world that survives by grit duty and the quiet labour of those who work unseen within its walls. You leave the castle's shadow behind and walk downhill toward the village again, following a path that grows softer with each step, the earth buried beneath layers of fresh snow. As you approach the cottages clustered near the centre, a faint sound reaches you, something light, high, and unexpectedly bright against the dull winter air. Laughter, thin, fleeting, but unmistakable. You follow it until you spot a small group of children tumbling across the snowy ground like restless birds, let loose after too long indoors. They run in uneven circles, boots slipping and sliding their cloaks, flapping behind them like makeshift wings. One child scoops up snow in mittened hands and shapes it into a crude sphere, before tossing it toward another, who dodges with an exaggerated hop. The snowball crumbles mid-air, sending a shower of powder that catches the faint afternoon light. Despite the cold, the children seem fueled by a stubborn warmth entirely their own, a warmth born from movement, mischief, and the determination to carve joy out of frozen days. A girl kneels near a patch of ice, tracing patterns with a slim stick. You watch her draw winding lines, circles, then tiny star shapes. A boy crouches beside her and adds his own marks, turning the design into something more elaborate. Documents from parish schools mention that children often spent long winter months practicing letters and symbols in snow or ash when parchment was scarce. Looking at these patterns, you wonder if the children even realize they're learning while they play. A small shout draws your attention. Two boys have discovered a narrow wooden plank, leaning against a shed, half buried in snow. They pull it free and drag it up a small mound, positioning it as a makeshift slide. After a conspiratorial glance, one pushes the other downward, and the plank skims along the icy surface before tipping over. The rider lands in a puff of powder, laughing so hard he curls into himself. His companion falls beside him moments later, equally delighted. A woman steps out of a nearby cottage, wiping her hands on her apron. She watches the scene with a mixture of amusement and worry, calling out occasional reminders not to stray too far. A cluster of dried herbs hangs above her doorway, stirring gently each time a child runs past. One bit of seasonal lore held that certain winter plants, pinned near the entrance, kept children safe from wandering spirits in the cold months. You notice similar bundles above several doorways, some neat, some frayed, some nearly lost in frost. A girl approaches you shyly, holding something in her mittened palm. When she opens her hand, you see a tiny carved figure, an animal shaped from a piece of old wood. Its features are simple but carefully etched. She explains between giggles that her brother carved it from scrap timber left by a carpenter. Ledger notes from rural households indicate that winter often brought a surge of Small crafts like this, toys made from leftover wood or bone to keep children occupied indoors. The figure feels surprisingly smooth when she places it briefly in your gloved hand, a small treasure born from scarcity. Across the lane, a group of older children forms a circle chanting a simple rhythm as they toss a ball, fashioned from tightly bound rags. The ball thumps softly against their palms, occasionally slipping into snow where they retrieve it with shouts of triumph. Interpretations vary on how common organised games were during medieval winters, but the scene before you suggests that children, regardless of era, invent their own play whenever space and energy allow. A little farther off, a few children gather near a frozen ditch, scratching lines across the ice with sticks. One boy carefully picks away at the frost, revealing the trapped water beneath. His friends watch with fascination as cracks branch outward like delicate veins. The girl from earlier warns him loudly not to break through, and he backs away dramatically, earning laughter from the others. You hear someone mention a tale told by elders that mischievous spirits lived beneath frozen ponds, snatching at the ankles of those who stepped too boldly. The children recount this with wide eyes and exaggerated gasps, delighting in the thrill of their own storytelling. A gust of wind sweeps through the village, scattering snow into spirals. The children squeal and chase the swirling powder, as if it were alive, their boots kicking up tiny clouds. Their cheeks glow red from cold, their noses run, and still they move with boundless energy that defies the season's weight. You catch snippets of conversation, boasts about imaginary battles, competitions over who can slide the farthest, playful debates about who saw a wolf last night near the woods. A pair of toddlers sits atop a low wooden sled as an older girl pulls them across the snowy ground. Their squeals pierce the air in bright bursts. She strains against the weight, but continues with determination, glancing back often to ensure they are still smiling. Household records describe sleds as both tools and toys used to carry firewood food, even younger siblings. Watching the girl now, you sense that work and play intertwine seamlessly in winter childhood. One boy approaches a half-buried tree stump and begins tapping a rhythm with 2 sticks. The beat is simple but persistent, and soon another child joins him, stomping in time. A loose circle forms, creating a spontaneous winter dance. Their boots slip and shuffle, their cloaks twist around them, and their laughter rises like warm breath. It is a moment of pure improvised joy. Off to the side, you spot a child gathering small stones from a patch of exposed ground. He arranges them carefully into a pattern on the snow circles, then squares, then something more abstract. When you ask what he's making, he shrugs shyly and says, "It's a puzzle he saw once on a merchant's board." Evidently, even in an era defined by oral tradition, children carried memories of games across towns and seasons. The puzzle grows slowly, one cold stone at a time. A few children break away from the group and run toward a cottage, tugging at its door, until someone inside hands them hot broth in small wooden cups. They cradle the cups in their hands, savouring each sip, steam curling around their faces. One child offers you a cup with a grin, and the warmth seeps into your gloves, carrying the faint scent of leeks and barley. As the afternoon deepens, the children's energy begins to wane. Some drift homeward, called by parents, others sit in the snow, catching their breath. A toddler stumbles, falls gently into a drift and bursts into laughter before being lifted by an older sibling. The air fills with the soft chatter of families preparing for evening. You take one last look at the playful scene, a collection of small fleeting joys carved out of a winter that wishes to take much more than it gives. Despite the cold, despite the hardship, the children have crafted their own brightness, scattering it across the snow like sparks that refuse to die. And as you step away, you feel that brightness follow you, a reminder that even in the harshest winters, resilience often begins in the smallest hands. You continue down the lane until the sound of children's laughter fades behind you, replaced by the steady, rhythmic clatter of tools striking wood and metal. It draws you toward a row of small workshops, low buildings, clustered together near the village's edge, each one breathing out thin threads of smoke. Even in the bitter cold, these workshops pulse with stubborn life. The craftspeople inside keep working because winter demands it. Rest comes later, when light fades completely or fingers no longer obey. You step into the first workshop, pushing through a curtain of thick cloth meant to block the draft. The air inside is warmer than you expect, scented with sawdust and resin. A carpenter stands at his bent shoulders, hunched, shaping a plank, with slow practiced motions. His breath forms pale clouds above the wood as he works. Chips fall in soft curls, scattering across the floor, where they mingle with frost carried in from outside. The plank he shapes looks destined for a door, one meant to keep the cold from stealing more of a family's warmth. He pauses, wiping his brow with the back of his sleeve. A ledger pinned to the wall lists requests for repairs, broken shutters, warped window frames, split beams. Records from rural estates indicate that winter often caused more structural damage than any battle-cold bending nails, frost-splitting timber storms, worrying roofs until they groaned under pressure. You sense that truth in the carpenter's weary posture, in the way he examines each crack as though measuring its threat. In the corner, a young apprentice sits cross-legged near a small brazier, warming his hands between tasks. He holds a tool, with great care, a chisel with a newly sharpened edge. When he lifts it, the blade briefly catches the flicker of firelight. The apprentice explains with shy pride that he sharpened it himself on a grindstone earlier that morning. You nod, admiring the precision. Winter may slow everything, but skill still advances one careful stroke at a time. You step back outside and cross into the next workshop, where the air shifts instantly, thicker, heavier, tinged with the unmistakable smell of heated metal. A blacksmith stands barefoot on straw, laid to insulate the floor hammer, raised, striking a glowing strip of iron resting on an anvil. The blow reverberates through your ribs. Sparks leap upward, flaring bright before vanishing into cold air. The blacksmith barely glances at them. He is too focused on shaping the iron into something useful, a latch perhaps, or a hinge or part of a tool that will see long days of hard work come spring. He dips the metal into a trough of half-frozen water. A violent hiss breaks the quiet, sending up a burst of steam. The heat lingers only a moment before the cold consumes it. Observers from the period wrote of how winter required smiths to stoke their forges, constantly feeding them wood, charcoal, or peat at a rate that strained even well-supplied households. Watching the blacksmith now, you can see why every draft threatening to undo minutes of meticulous work. In a corner of the smithy, a woman repairs harness straps. Her fingers move quickly, despite the cold pulling leather, taut as she stitches along its edge. A small pot of tallow sits nearby, softening in the forge's heat. She dips her finger into it, occasionally rubbing the mixture along the seams to keep the leather supple. One quiet fragment of everyday life tells us that leather workers often doubled their pace in winter, repairing shoes, belts, and harnesses worn thin by frost-hardened terrain. Her presence confirms this, a craftsperson battling not only damage, but time. You exit the smithy and follow the muffled sound of a loom creaking beneath steady hands. The next workshop is filled with strands of wool stretched across wooden frames. A weaver sits at her loom, wrapped in layers that still fail to fully protect her from the cold. Her feet work the pedals rhythmically, while her hands guide threads into tight, disciplined rows. The cloth forming beneath her fingers is thick, plain, and durable, exactly what people need when the world outside threatens to freeze them solid. Bundles of dyed wool hang overhead, their colours dulled by winter light. Deep reds, muted blues, earth-toned browns. A faint scent of lanolin clings to the air. One rarely mentioned detail preserved in guild accounts notes that winter spinning produced stronger, more consistent threads because cold air tightened the fibres. Watching the weaver beat each row firmly into place, you suspect that even hardship gives rise to its own subtle advantages. As you watch, she pauses to warm her hands near a small clay pot filled with glowing coals. The pot radiates just enough heat to keep her fingers nimble. She tells you quietly that weaving does not stop for winter. If anything, demand increases as families search desperately for warmth in whatever form they can afford. You sense the burden in her voice, the exhaustion laced into her movements, yet also a calm acceptance this work sustains her household, and so she continues. Beyond the weaving shed, you hear the rhythmic scrape of a knife against wood. Following the sound, you find a cooper fitting iron hoops onto a barrel. His workshop smells of oak shavings and cold iron. The barrel staves soaked in warm water earlier, now steam faintly as he adjusts them. He tests each joint, tapping lightly, listening for a hollow note that might betray weakness. Winter forces him to work with extra caution. Wood contracts in the cold, narrowing gaps and tightening joints. The cooper mutters that if the barrel survives winter, it will survive anything. A small table beside him holds 2 bowls, one filled with resin, the other with a thick paste of beeswax used to seal cracks. Beeswax was precious in winter, often saved for candles rather than repairs, yet the cooper uses it sparingly, pressing it into thin seams. Some modern analysts point out that such practices helped extend the life of vital containers through harsh conditions, preserving grain or ale that could not be easily replenished. Watching the cooper work feels like observing someone quietly safeguarding a household's future. You step outside once more, snow crunching underfoot. A leatherworker's shed stands nearby, its door open, just enough to release the warm, smoky scent of curing hides. Inside, a craftsman stretches a hide across a frame, scraping away frost and smoothing its edges. The repetitive motion suggests both skill and necessity. Leather hardens in winter, cracking easily, if not tended, and every pair of boots in the village depends on this workshop's success. At the centre of the workshop cluster, a small fire pit burns weakly. A few workers gather around it during short breaks, sharing brief stretches of warmth before returning to their tasks. One passes around a cup filled with spiced ale, warm, thin and fragrant. The workers drink from it slowly, savouring the fleeting comfort. You stand with them for a moment, letting the fire's warmth fight its way into your gloves. Their faces glow in the flickering light, weary but resolute. Some speak quietly about the storm, others about orders that must be finished by nightfall, others about families waiting at home. Each voice carries a mixture of fatigue and perseverance, found in communities that survive through collective effort. As you walk away from the workshops, the sounds linger, the clatter of metal, the scrape of wood, the creak of looms, all weaving together into a chorus of resilience. Even in the dead of winter, even when the world seems to freeze in place, these craftspeople continue to shape, mend and create. Their hands keep the village alive. You tilt your face toward the pale sky, letting snow settle lightly on your eyelashes. Somewhere between the faint hammering behind you and the soft crunch of your footsteps ahead, you realize that winter's harshest truth is also its quiet gift. It reminds you how much human persistence can build, even when the world tries its hardest to take things apart. You leave the cluster of workshops behind, stepping into the growing twilight as the sky dims into muted shades of violet and grey. The wind has softened, but the air carries a weight that feels almost expectant, as if something unseen listens from the edges of the fields. As you walk toward the centre of the village, faint murmurs spill from doorways and windows, low voices sharing news suspicions, and stray wonders carried on the cold breath of winter. Nights like this stretch longer than any candle can endure, and conversation becomes both shield and companion. You enter a small alehouse, its door creaking open to release a burst of warmth and the smell of smoke-laced air. Inside, villagers gather in loose clusters around the hearth, their faces illuminated by flickering orange light. The alehouse is plain wooden benches, a few rough tables and a bar built from planks worn smooth by countless hands. But the atmosphere feels alive, charged by the gentle hum of shared voices. You remove some of the frost clinging to your cloak and take a seat near a group deep in conversation. They speak in hushed, earnest tones about the storm that nearly buried travellers hours ago. One man insists he saw strange lights swirling through the snow, dancing like spirits caught between worlds. A woman shakes her head, but admits the storm moved too quickly to feel entirely natural. A local account from the period describes winter storms that villagers believed borrowed breath from unseen forces. Hearing these voices now, you understand how such impressions took root when nature becomes unpredictable. Imagination rushes to fill the gaps. Someone mentions the river to the north frozen solid weeks earlier. Another swears the freeze happened overnight, a claim that earns raised eyebrows, but no outright rejection. Interpretations of natural events blur easily in long winters when darkness stretches across whole evenings and memories dissolve into guesswork. You sip from a cup offered by the barkeep, a thin ale warmed just enough to loosen the chill in your throat, and listen as the talk shifts like snow, drifting from one rooftop to another. A young shepherd leans in his voice, carrying the roughness of wind exposure. He tells the room that he found peculiar footprints near the woods earlier, larger than any wolf's spaced far apart. A few listeners murmur intrigued. Others dismiss the tale as a trick of refrozen snow. Curious, you picture the shepherd's world, trudging through dawn frost. Hearing things the wind distorts, seeing shapes half buried beneath powder. Unusual sights are easy to stumble upon in winter. Explanations are harder to settle. The barkeep joins in, wiping a mug with a cloth stiffened by repeated washings. He recalls a story his grandmother once told, that on certain winter nights, the air listens, and the wise keep their words soft. The villagers chuckle, not fully believing, but not dismissing it either. Rural households often pass such sayings through generations, not firm beliefs, but gentle warnings tied to long memory. Their persistence reveals more about winter's psychological weight than about superstition. You glance around the alehouse, shadows leap across the rafters as the fire pops and shifts. A few villagers sit closer to the flame, bundled tightly, whispering about grain stores rumoured to be running low. One woman recalls hearing a cart creaking along the road last night. Too late for honest travel, she says. A man suggests it was just a merchant delayed by snow. Another argues merchants rarely travel alone. The fragmented nature of winter news carried through rumour rather than certainty heightens every small detail into something larger. Across the room, two men huddle over a simple wooden board scratched with grid lines. They move small stones from square to square, muttering strategies under their breath. When one loses a piece, he claims the board is uneven from cold warping, sparking a playful argument. During harsh winters, simple games like this provided essential distraction, and mentions of them appear sporadically in community records. You watch the men play with surprising intensity, their breaths visible as faint puffs. A gust of wind rattles the shutters, startling a few people. The fire responds with a sudden flare, sending a spray of sparks into the air. For a moment, conversation pauses. Everyone listens, half expecting the wind to carry something more than sound. Then someone laughs nervously and the room exhales together. Low light and imagination often weave like threads in long winters, each strengthening the other. One man older than the rest begins telling a story, passed down from his father, a tale of a traveller who claimed to hear choruses in the forest at night, voices, without bodies singing, in tones that made even the wolves retreat. The children in the alehouse lean closer, eyes wide. Adults exchange skeptical glances, though no one interrupts him. In winter, stories walk easily between belief and entertainment. You recognize this as part of the season's rhythm. When night presses close, storytelling pushes back. A woman seated at the hearth counters with a tale of her own about lights seen across the marsh last winter, glowing blue for a full hour. Her companion suggests the phenomena might have been swamp gas, though the term he uses is far older and less scientific. Another listener insists the lights were too bright for anything natural. The alehouse fills with soft debate, good-natured but tinged with unease. Surviving chronicles often mention winter sightings that defy clear explanation, leaving modern researchers with inconsistent accounts and many unanswered questions. You sip your ale and let the voices blend around you. Rumour, memory, imagination, fear, they swirl together, like winter wind shaping a shared experience that binds the community more tightly than the fire does. The alehouse becomes a refuge, not just from cold, but from uncertainty. People talk to make sense of things or to forget them for a while. When you finally step outside again, the night greets you with cold so crisp it crackles in your lungs. The sound of conversation fades behind you, yet its warmth lingers. The sky above glows faintly, with reflected snowlight, and the village seems to hum with quiet swirling stories. Some born from truth, others from winter's habit of stretching imagination thin. As you walk back toward the lane, you feel the weight of rumour and wonder, trailing behind light, as drifting flakes yet impossible to shake. In a season where certainty is scarce, people lean into stories, hoping perhaps that understanding the unseen might make the cold a little less daunting. You wake the next morning to a sky the colour of burnished pewter, the air still and heavy, as though the village holds its breath in anticipation. Today is Christmas Mass, a moment meant to offer warmth of spirit, even when the world outside feels carved from ice. You follow the slow-moving stream of villagers toward the small stone church, each person bundled so tightly in wool and fur that their shapes blur into one another. Their boots crunch across the hardened snow in a soft, steady cadence. Inside, the church has changed since your last visit. More candles have been lit, though still far fewer than tradition calls for. Their glow gathers in tender pools of light that drift along the floor and climb the walls like golden mist. The cold is still present, numbing your fingers and settling onto the stone like a thin glaze, but the room feels gentler somehow, soothed by the soft murmur of anticipation. As families shuffle into place, you notice an embroidered cloth laid across the altar, its threads gleaming faintly. A notation from a surviving parish inventory mentions how churches saved their finest linens specifically for Christmastide, even if they were patched or faded. Seeing this cloth now worn but dignified, you sense how deeply the community values this moment of reprieve. A young girl carries a bundle of evergreens to the front, placing them near the altar. Their scent rises into the cold air, sharp, resinous, reminiscent of forests that feel impossibly distant in winter. Some villagers bow their heads as the greenery is set in place. A remnant of old seasonal practice held that evergreens symbolized endurance life that persisted even in the hardest months. You see that symbolism woven into the villagers' expressions, quiet but resolute. The priest enters with slow measured steps, his breath forming pale clouds as he moves. He pauses near the altar, carefully arranging a small book bound in cracked leather. When he lifts his hands to begin, the congregation falls into a hush so complete that even the candles seem to flicker more softly. He speaks with a voice worn thin by cold and long nights, yet there is strength beneath it, a steady thread that gathers the room together. His words echo against the stone, filling the church with a rhythm that feels both familiar and fragile. In descriptions penned by clerics of the era, Winter Mass is said to carry a kind of austere beauty shaped as much by hardship as by ritual. Listening now, you understand how scarcity sharpens reverence, how cold heightens the weight of every phrase. As the priest continues, a young acolyte steps forward to assist, though he trembles slightly from the chill. His thin robe offers little protection, yet his focus remains unwavering. He holds a candle aloft, its flame stretching upward in defiance of the draught that slips across the floor. Several villagers smile at him, a brief warming gesture. Midway through the service, the congregation begins a hymn. Their voices rise hesitantly, at first many clearing throats roughened by winter air. The melody grows bolder, with each line drifting upward until it fills the church like a soft tide. You notice, though, that the song is slower than versions you may have heard elsewhere, the cold steel's breath quickly shaping the pace of worship. Surviving manuscripts offer no exact notations for medieval melodies, but scholars comparing regional traditions still disagree on whether winter hymns were deliberately slowed to match the season or simply adapted by necessity. As you listen, the latter seems likely. Children fidget near their parents, their cheeks flushed from the walk. One boy tries to mimic the priest's gestures, only to receive a gentle nudge from his mother. A toddler sleeps against her father's shoulder, tiny fingers curled around the edge of his cloak. Their presence adds a softness to the gathering, like small embers glowing in a bed of coals. During a brief silence, the priest moves to light a few additional candles along the nave. Each wick ignites reluctantly, as if resisting the cold. One flame gutters low, nearly dying before catching its strength again. The villagers watch these small flames with near-reverence lights that hold on despite everything. An older woman presses her hand to her chest, whispering a quiet word of thanks. Beside you, a farmer shifts his weight and murmurs that his stores of barley may not last until spring. The man next to him squeezes his shoulder and replies that they will help one another, as they always have. Their exchange is simple, but its sincerity resonates more deeply than any formal blessing. As the service nears its close, the priest steps forward with a chalice, its metal dull from age, its rim slightly dented. He handles it with careful respect. The chalice glints faintly in the candlelight, and you recall passing references from monastic scribes who noted that sacred items often endured decades of repair and reuse, carrying the physical history of entire communities within their worn surfaces. The final prayer begins. Voices murmur together, weaving through the cold air. You close your eyes briefly and feel the church shift, not physically, but emotionally. The space seems to gather warmth from its people, as if their shared breath, shared fears, and shared hopes combine into something greater than individual bodies could produce. For a moment, even the draft quiets. When the prayer ends, the congregation exhales collectively. The priest blesses the gathered villagers with a steady hand, his breath drifting upward like incense. People begin to rise, boots scraping softly against the straw-covered floor. Cloaks are fastened, scarves tied more tightly. The subtle rustle of fabric fills the room like gentle snowfall. As villagers file toward the door, the acolyte snuffs the candles one by one. Wisps of smoke spiral upward, carrying the last traces of warmth. The child leans close to ensure each wick is safely extinguished, his breath forming tiny clouds of effort. You step outside into cold that bites instantly at your cheeks. The sky has brightened in delicate tones, a pale wash of pink and gold slipping between clouds. Villagers linger near the entrance, exchanging soft greetings, offering one another small smiles that seem to hold more weight than usual. Even in winter's grasp, Christmas has managed to kindle something gentle inside them. You pull your cloak tight and walk among them, feeling the quiet glow of the service settle into your bones. The day ahead will still be hard, the winter still unrelenting, but for a moment the villagers stand together under the fragile promise of light. You remain outside the church for a few breaths, letting the last of the hymn settle in your chest like a fading ember. Then you follow the villagers as they drift back toward their homes, ready to prepare whatever modest meal the season allows. Christmas feasts in winters like this are not grand celebrations. They are careful, thoughtful, and often quieter than any storybook suggests. Still, there is a certain tenderness woven into them, a determination to create warmth even when ingredients, time and energy feel painfully scarce. As you approach one cottage, the scent of simmering broth escapes through a cracked window, a thin ribbon of fragrance that feels almost miraculous in the cold. You step inside where a family gathers around a small wooden table. The room glows with the orange light of a hearth that burns lower than the occasion deserves, but higher than they can comfortably afford. A pot hangs suspended above the embers, bubbling slowly, its lid clinking with each small rise of steam. A ledger fragment, preserved from a neighbouring region, describes how many families stretch their winter stores by soaking stale bread in broth, turning scraps into something filling. You watch now as the mother slices a hard, dark loaf with deliberate precision, her knife pressing down in steady strokes. The sound of the crust cracking echoes softly. She lays each slice into a wooden bowl, then ladles broth on top the liquid, softening the bread instantly. The aroma rises, onions, barley, a hint of dried herbs, and though simple, it carries a quiet comfort. A handful of root vegetables lies on the table, 2 carrots, a turnip, a single parsnip with its top trimmed. The father peels them slowly, careful not to waste even a sliver. A child watches intently, offering the bowl to catch the shavings. Families often relied on such cooperative tasks during harsh winters. One notation in a surviving household account mentions hands, shared, make the work and the meal both larger. You sense that truth in the synchronized movements before you, each person contributing in small, meaningful ways. Once the vegetables are added to the pot, the room fills with richer scent. The broth deepens in colour, faintly golden. The children hover near the hearth, drawn by the warmth. One reaches out a tentative hand before pulling back quickly from the heat. Their cheeks glow pink more from excitement than from the cold just beyond the walls. On a small shelf wrapped in cloth sits the rarest ingredient in the room, a single preserved sausage. The mother unwraps it, slices it into thin coins, and drops them into the pot. The pieces sizzle briefly before disappearing beneath the surface. Not long ago, a sausage like this would have been merely one dish among many. Today, its presence feels like luxury. Families commonly saved such preserved meats for feast days, and references from winter accounts speak of slicing them thin as prayer, ensuring every member tasted at least a little. Watching the sausage vanish into the bubbling broth, you see how carefully celebration must be measured. A child retrieves a jar from a high shelf, honey golden and thick, though only a small amount clings to the bottom. The mother hesitates before taking it. Honey in winter is precious, a store of sweetness that must last months. Still, she dips her finger inside and smears a thin ribbon of it onto a scrap of bread for each child. Their eyes light up instantly. Seasonal customs often allowed for small indulgences on feast days, even in hardship. The joy on their faces makes the decision worth every drop. Meanwhile, a neighbour arrives with a clay pot of her own stew, made from lentils and cabbage. She offers it without ceremony, placing it gently on the table. In return, the family hands her a small bundle of dried herbs wrapped in cloth. Exchanging food between households was not only generosity, but a practical act of survival. Mutual support held communities together in winters that threatened to pull them apart. As preparations continue, the father pulls out a wooden bowl filled with small shriveled apples stored from autumn. Many bear brown spots, but a few remain firm. He selects the best ones, slicing them carefully, and warming them in a pan of spiced wine, diluted heavily with water. The scent of cloves drifts through the air, soft and fleeting. A faint note in a merchant's journal describes spiced drinks watered so thin the cloves did all the work, and you suspect this family relies on similar magic, letting spices carry the illusion of abundance. The meal comes together, slowly shaped more by creativity than by ingredients. The table is set with simple wooden bowls, each one smoothed from years of use. The children help arrange them, their fingers tracing patterns in the wood. A soft hum of anticipation begins to fill the small room. As everyone gathers, the mother ladles the thickened stew into each bowl, careful to ensure every portion contains at least one slice of sausage and a generous ladle of broth-soaked bread. The vegetables appear in the mix like bright, humble jewels. The family bows their heads, murmuring a few quiet words of gratitude. The warmth from the hearth glows across their faces, softening even the harshest lines of fatigue. Once they begin to eat, the sound of spoons scraping bowls becomes a steady rhythm, soothing as snowfall. The children lean close to their parents, sharing smiles between mouthfuls. You watch steam rise from each bowl, catching the faint shimmer of firelight. After several minutes, the neighbour returns, carrying a small bundle of cloth. When she unwraps it, a few roasted chestnuts tumble out. Their shells crack with a gentle pop as she presses them open. The family reacts with excitement. Roasted chestnuts are rare treasures in midwinter, often associated with celebration. Some scholars of seasonal tradition still debate the exact origins of chestnut feasts in medieval households, but the delight on the children's faces now speaks louder than any manuscript. One of the children offers you a chestnut from her own share. You hold it in your glove, feeling its faint warmth. The gesture is small but not insignificant. Generosity in a winter like this is a statement of resilience, as though the act itself pushes back against the cold. The meal ends slowly, in contented silence. Bowls are scraped clean, and the last crumbs of bread are savoured. The mother places the empty pot near the fire to soak, while the father gathers the children into his arms. Their laughter softens into sleepy murmurs, weighed down by warmth and food. You step outside where the snow glimmers faintly under a sky turning deeper blue. Behind you, you hear the family humming a modest tune, an offering of joy that rises into the cold evening air like a hopeful lantern. And for a moment, despite everything winter has taken, the village feels full. You leave the warm glow of the cottage behind and step into a night that has sharpened again, the cold settling over the village like a fresh layer of glass. Darkness stretches across the snow in deep blue shadows, and your breath curls upward in slow plumes that drift toward the thin crescent moon. This is the hour when the world grows quiet, when fires dim, when families retreat indoors, and when those tasked with keeping watch step forward into the open, accepting the loneliness that comes with vigilance. You follow the faint crunch of footsteps leading toward the village's edge. There beside the low stone wall that marks the boundary between cultivated land and wild field, two figures stand wrapped in heavy cloaks. One leans on a wooden staff, the other carries a lantern whose flame trembles but refuses to go out. These are the night watchmen chosen for strength of body, steadiness of mind, and the ability to stay awake while the world sleeps. Their presence embodies a kind of quiet guardianship that rural communities depended on throughout the darker months. The older watchman greets you with a nod, frost collecting in his beard. He explains in a low voice that winter nights draw out more than cold foxes sniffing at chicken coops, wolves drifting close in search of stray goat thieves, emboldened by long shadows. Notes in surviving manorial court records show that winter theft rose significantly during harsh years. Hunger pressed some to desperate acts, and darkness provided cover. Listening to the watchman now, you sense not fear, but a steady, measured alertness shaped by experience. You walk with the pair as they patrol the outer homes. Each cottage they pass is dark except for a faint glow of embers behind a shutter. The snow around the houses has been brushed into narrow paths, crisp lines that cut through the whiteness, like careful signatures. The watchmen pause occasionally to listen to the shifting snow, to wind slipping around corners, to anything out of place. One lifts his lantern toward a cluster of bushes, its light catching the glitter of frost along thin branches. A sharp howl rises in the distance, echoing along the frozen fields. The younger watchman stiffens his hand, tightening around the staff. The older one exhales slowly, listening with practiced calm. He identifies the sound as a lone wolf, far enough away not to pose immediate danger. Forest ledgers from the time occasionally mention wolves descending into villages during the coldest winters, but such events were unpredictable, sporadic flashes of wildness at the edges of human life. Tonight's howl seems more like a reminder that the wild still waits beyond the fields. You reach a shepherd's enclosure, where a small flock huddles together for warmth, their wool steaming faintly in the cold. A dog pads along the fence's perimeter, ears perked, breath puffing in short bursts. The shepherd emerges from a nearby shed cloak drawn tight. He exchanges a few quiet words with the watchman, reporting that one ewe seems restless and keeps shifting her weight. He's concerned it might be the start of illness. A modest handbook compiled by rural clerics mentions that winter often stressed livestock to their limits, with small signs like this sometimes preceding more serious problems. The shepherd speaks of it with weary pragmatism. The watchmen reassure him, promising to keep an eye on the enclosure during their rounds. As you walk away, you hear the shepherd soothing the ewe softly, his voice merging with the wind. A lantern light flickers ahead, another watchman stationed near the granary. When you approach, he lifts the lantern to reveal a row of heavy wooden doors, secured with iron latches. The granary holds the village's precious grain stores, and its protection is essential. The watchman checks each latch carefully, brushing away frost to inspect the metal for cracks. Theft, spoilage, or intrusion by rodents could spell disaster in a winter this severe. A surviving agricultural memorandum from the early 15th century emphasises how communities assign their most trusted men to guard grain at night, especially during feast days, when drunkenness or distraction might weaken vigilance. You move on, letting the hiss of wind fill the silence between steps. Overhead clouds drift apart, revealing more of the starry sky. The moon hangs thin and pale, offering little light, but providing just enough to cast faint outlines across the snow. The younger watchman points toward the forest edge, squinting. He claims he saw movement there earlier, a flash of white shifting between trees. Perhaps a snow hare, perhaps something else. The uncertainty hovers in the air longer than the comment itself. A small hut stands at the far edge of the village, its door slightly ajar. The older watchman steps forward, pushing it closed and securing the latch. Inside you glimpse bundles of firewood, stacked neatly. The hut is community property, intended for those who run out of fuel unexpectedly. A mention in a local winter ordinance describes shared stores like this as mercy huts replenished by neighbours whenever possible. Tonight the supply is modest but intact. As you continue your patrol, you hear the distant clatter of something falling. The watchmen tense, exchanging glances, then quicken their pace toward the sound. You follow, stepping carefully on the uneven snow. When you reach the source, you see a bucket lying on its side near a cottage door. A cat darts out from behind it, startled by the attention. The younger watchman laughs softly, rubbing his forehead. Tension dissolves into quiet relief. Still, the older man examines the ground, studying impressions in the snow. He points out a set of footprints, small, narrow, likely belonging to a child who ventured outside earlier. He checks the distance between steps, then nods, satisfied that the tracks pose no concern. Modern analysts reviewing similar winter patrol descriptions note how skilled night watchmen were at interpreting even faint marks in snow-reading stories from subtle patterns. Watching this man now, you see that skill alive in his deliberate gaze. The night deepens, growing colder with each passing hour. A faint veil of frost forms along your cloak, and gloves turning the fabric stiff. Your breath feels heavier in your chest, the cold settling into your bones. Yet strangely, the world feels clearer in this hour. Every sound amplified, every shadow distinct, every small movement carrying meaning. Eventually, the watchmen pause on a rise overlooking the village. From here, the cottages form a scattering of dark shapes against the snow. Thin ribbons of smoke rise from chimneys, twisting upward into the star-flecked sky. The older watchman lowers the lantern and rests his weight on his staff, taking a slow breath. He explains that nights like these are both burden and privilege. A burden because cold and danger press close, a privilege because watching over a sleeping community affirms one's place within it. The younger watchman nods, though his shivering reveals how taxing the role can be. He offers you a small smile, teeth chattering softly. You stand together for a moment, letting the stillness expand around you. The village sleeps behind shuttered windows. The fields stretch outward in silver quiet. The woods whisper faintly at their edges. The watchmen shoulder their duties without complaint, carrying the weight of vigilance while others rest. When you finally part ways, the older watchman raises his lantern in a brief gesture of farewell. Its flame wavers gently, casting a warm glow across his frost-covered beard. You turn back toward the village, feeling the deep quiet of night settle over your shoulders like an immense cold cloak, but also feeling the warmth of shared purpose lingering somewhere within. You walk beyond the last cottage where the village gives way to open land once used for grazing and cultivation. Now in the depths of winter, it lies dormant beneath a thick quilt of snow. The moon casts an icy sheen across the frozen fields, making every drift look like a silent wave caught mid-crest. You follow a narrow winding footpath that disappears and reappears, depending on how the wind sculpted the snow earlier in the day. Your boots sink slightly with each step, leaving a clear trail behind you, one that the morning sun will soften into obscurity. At the crest of a small ridge, you pause. The world stretches out in a muted palette, pale blues, ghostly whites, and the dark silhouettes of distant tree lines. The land seems peaceful from here, but you know what lies beneath this stillness. An old manor house sits just ahead, its stone walls rising from the snow like the remnants of a shipwreck preserved in ice. Once vigorous with activity, the manor now feels sparse and subdued, its windows dim, its chimneys exhaling thin lines of smoke that fade almost instantly into the night. You approach the front entry, where a servant struggles to sweep snow away from the doorstep. Her broom scratches softly against the stone. She glances up with tired eyes but greets you with a polite nod before continuing her task. Inside the manor's hall is quiet, too quiet for what once served as the economic heart of this land. Records kept by wintertime officials mention how snowbound months strained estates, slowing trade routes and disrupting deliveries of grain, salt and fuel. The hush around you feels like the echo of those disruptions. The steward enters from a side door, his posture straight, but his movements weighted. He carries a ledger bound in cracked leather. When he sees you, he folds it against his chest with a weary sigh. He motions you closer, his voice low as he explains the challenges the household faces: stores running thin, servants falling ill, tools breaking faster than they can be repaired. He turns a few pages, revealing neat columns of numbers, tallies of grain, dried peas, salted meat. At the bottom of one page, you notice a total circled heavily in ink. The steward taps it with one finger and says it must last until the thaw. His expression makes it clear he doubts it will. You follow him into the manor kitchen, where a single hearth burns with quiet determination. The cook, wrapped in layers of wool, stirs a heavy pot of pottage, thick brown and steaming faintly. A few turnip slices float on the surface. The cook murmurs that this will be the household supper. In better years, the manor kitchen spilled over with abundance. Winter feasts included roast meats, honeyed pastries and spiced wine. But tonight's meal is closer to what the villagers eat, simple, filling and born of necessity. At a nearby table, a maid kneels beside a stack of firewood, selecting the driest pieces to carry upstairs. Her hands shake slightly as she works. She whispers that the upper rooms are cold enough to frost the inside of their windows. A passing observation from the era notes that manor households often slept in their warmest garments during severe winters, layering cloaks and shawls atop blankets stuffed with straw. Hearing the maid describe the upper floors, you imagine long corridors filled with shimmering frost like delicate lace. A faint noise draws your attention to a side corridor. You find the lord of the manor sitting in a small chamber beside a hearth that barely warms the room. He holds a sealed letter, its broken wax revealing urgency rather than ceremony. He gestures for you to sit. As he explains, the letter arrived at dusk with troubling news. Several neighbouring estates are struggling even more severely than this one. Their workers have fallen sick, their livestock have weakened, their grain supplies dwindle at alarming rates. A faint thread of old practice suggested neighbouring manors share excess stores in crisis, but this year few have anything to spare. The lord rubs his temples tiredly. He speaks of the responsibility he carries, how every person on the estate, from the youngest stable hand to the eldest tenant farmer, looks to him for leadership. Yet he confesses that leadership feels thin in winters, like this stretched to its limits by fear and uncertainty. Those who study these events reach no shared conclusion about how medieval lords interpreted their duties during extreme weather. Some accounts portray stern pragmatism, others deep personal anguish. The man before you seems to embody both. A servant enters quietly, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. She places it on a table near the hearth and opens it to reveal wool garments, repaired repeatedly, patched with mismatched pieces, and still insufficient for the cold. She asks permission to distribute them among the workers. The lord nods without hesitation. The servant gathers the garments again and leaves the room swiftly, her footsteps fading down the corridor. You follow another hallway, passing shuttered windows that tremble whenever a gust rattles the exterior walls. The manor chapel sits at the end, small and dimly lit. A single candle flickers on the makeshift altar, its flame bending at the slightest draught. A few servants kneel on straw mats, murmuring prayers not for celebration, but for endurance. Their voices weave through the cold air like strands of fragile silk. In an adjoining room, you find the manor's granary, a stout structure with thick wooden beams and a stone floor. The air inside is biting colder than outside. A steward's assistant stands beside several large bins, each filled with grain measured down to the last handful. She makes notes on a small tablet, her breath frosting in front of her. Only a few bins remain half full. The sight sends a chill through you, deeper than the cold itself. Hunger needs no permission to enter a household. It arrives quietly, without ceremony. Outside again, you circle toward the livestock pens. A stable hand rubs a horse's flank with a coarse cloth, trying to warm the animal. Its ribs show faintly beneath its winter coat. The stable hand sighs, explaining that the horse once carried trade goods along distant routes, but now it rarely leaves the stable. Travel has become dangerous. Snow hides pitfalls, ice breaks cartwheels, and wind blinds even the most seasoned riders. He strokes the horse's muzzle, whispering a promise that spring will come. You wonder how many promises winter forces people to make to animals, to children, to themselves. A faint snow begins to fall, its flakes drifting slowly like ash from an unseen fire. The manor grounds look beautiful beneath it, soft, quiet, serene, but the beauty masks the strain. Families throughout the estate survive by ingenuity and shared effort, stretching cloth, rationing food, breaking ice for livestock, repairing tools. By candlelight, the burden presses on every shoulder, yet the community persists. You walk back toward the ridge where you began, pausing to look at the manor one last time. Its silhouette stands firm against the falling snow, a reminder that even when resources thin and spirits waver, resilience is built not from abundance, but from perseverance. The cold nips at your fingers, urging you onward. You turn toward the village lights, flickering in the distance, carrying with you the weight of winter's quiet battles and the stubborn endurance stitched into every breath of this frozen season. You follow the ridge back toward the village, letting the snowfall thicken around you like a slow closing curtain. By the time you reach the first cottages, night has deepened into a velvety blue, the kind that muffles every sound and softens every edge. Lanterns glow faintly behind shutters, their lights spilling through cracks in thin golden lines. Inside those homes, families settle into the rituals that carry them through the longest nights of the year, rituals shaped not by abundance, but by care, habit, and the quiet determination to make darkness feel less immense. You step into one such cottage, guided by a warm invitation from its doorway. The interior hums with gentle motion. A pair of elders sit wrapped in thick cloaks, their feet propped near the hearth's low flames. A young woman kneads dough at a table dusted with flour, her hands moving slowly, rhythmically, as though coaxing warmth into the room with each press. Near the window, a child threads dried berries onto a string tongue, peeking from the corner of their mouth in concentration. The air smells faintly of smoke, honey, and damp wool, winter's familiar perfume. On a shelf above the hearth sits a narrow wooden box filled with scraps of parchment. One of the elders pulls a sheet from the box and smooths it on their knee. He explains softly that these are fragments of old tales, copied, borrowed, or half-remembered, kept for nights like this. A passing mention in a mid-15th century household note suggests that families often preserved their favourite narratives, not for education, but for comfort, revisiting them when cold and darkness pressed too close. The elder begins reading aloud in a warm, gravelly voice. His cadence rises and falls with the ease of memory. The story is simple. A traveller lost in snow finds guidance from a star that appears only in the darkest hours. The tale stirs faint smiles across the room. The young woman's hands pause mid-knead. The child stops threading berries to listen. You watch as the words weave through the space, pulling everyone a little closer. Even the shadows seem to lean toward the sound. The elder finishes and folds the parchment neatly, placing it back in the box. His companion then lifts a small wooden figurine, a crude carving of a boar worn soft at the edges. She rubs her thumb along its back. Some households pass down a belief that toys or tokens made during the coldest days held luck for the coming year. Whether true or not, the figurine carries the weight of memory, winters survived, loved ones, remembered small joys preserved like embers. She hands it to the child, who holds it reverently before setting it near the bed. A soft tapping sounds at the door. When the young woman opens it, a neighbour enters with a jug wrapped in cloth. Inside is a thin ale steeped with winter herbs. She offers it quietly, explaining that she brewed it earlier to ease aching throats. The family accepts it gratefully. A modest exchange like this mirrors those described in local notations, from the era small acts of mutual aid that tied villages tightly together when the cold threatened to unravel them. As the drink is shared, conversation drifts through topics gentle and practical. Someone mentions seeing faint lights along the distant ridge at dusk, perhaps travellers leaving the manor, perhaps nothing more than moonlight shifting on snow. Interpretations among present-day researchers diverge widely on the reliability of such winter sightings, many believing that cold darkness and exhaustion created illusions. But the villagers entertain the idea with curiosity rather than fear. Their voices calm, their expression steady. The young woman finishes shaping the dough and sets it near the fire to rise. She pulls a small pouch from a shelf, precious spices saved from autumn market days, and sprinkles a pinch onto the warm stones by the hearth. The aroma unfurls slowly, filling the room with sweetness. A seasonal notion in local memory claimed that pleasing scents help soften the night, encouraging restful sleep. Whether it works or not, the moment feels gentler for it. A lull settles over the cottage as fatigue begins pressing softly at the edges of wakefulness. The child curls beneath a wool blanket, patched many times over, tracing the worn seams with one finger. The elders whisper a few final stories from earlier winters, some humorous, some wistful, all tinged with gratitude. The young woman extinguishes one of the candles, dimming the room to a calm glow. You step outside again to give them rest. The snow falls more lightly now, drifting like powdered light. The village lies quiet, its rooftops softened into rounded shapes, its chimneys breathing slow curls of smoke. The air feels cold enough to hush even the slightest movement, yet warm enough strangely to carry the memory of everything you've seen. Hardship, yes, but also care, also resolve. You walk toward the ridge one last time, looking back at the lantern-lit windows scattered across the village. Each one guards a tiny world of persistence, hands mending cloth, voices sharing tales, families leaning into warmth however they can find it. And standing under the wide winter sky, you sense how these small choices repeated across generations are what carried communities through winters far harsher than this one. Above you, the moon hangs suspended like a smooth cold coin, illuminating the snow with just enough light to walk by. You follow that pale glow, letting it guide you forward into the vast frozen quiet. Let the night soften around you now. The harsh winds, the bitter cold, the weight of those long ago winters, they're fading into a gentle hush, leaving only a quiet sense of resilience lingering in the air. Imagine the snow settling on rooftops and fields, not as a threat but as a soft protective blanket covering the world in slow stillness. Breathe in, letting the cold, crisp air of that distant century mellow into something calm and cool inside your chest. The villagers close their shutters, hearths dim into warm embers. Footsteps fade. Every sound becomes softer, slower, like the world exhaling after a long day. You walk through the quiet village, feeling the tension unwind from your shoulders, your breath falling into a steady, restful rhythm. The moon glows faintly overhead, a gentle guide easing you toward rest. And as the last lights flicker beneath snow-covered eaves, you settle into the same peace that carried those long-ago families through the coldest nights, steady, warm, unhurried. Let your thoughts drift like slow-falling snow. Let your eyes grow heavier. You've walked far tonight, and now the world around you grows still. Sweet dreams. End of script.